Chapter 821. Rin Ashbluff. 7. I tried to wave off the gratitude with casual dismissal, but my hand barely managed to lift a few inches before falling back to my side. The toll of using Mythweaver at such an intensive level was significant, but not quite enough to render me unconscious. Just thoroughly drained in ways that went beyond simple physical fatigue. "Arthur," Valen said, his voice thick with emotion as he turned toward me while still keeping one arm around Rin's shoulders. "I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. What you've done here, it's beyond miraculous. It's impossible made real." The king of the Western continent, the man I had fought to a standstill just hours earlier, looked at me with something approaching reverence. His usual stoic composure had been completely shattered by the return of his daughter, leaving behind only a father overwhelmed by joy and gratitude. "You don't owe me anything," I managed to say, my voice hoarse but steady. "Rin deserved to be saved. She always did." "Still," Camilla interjected softly, reaching out to squeeze my hand with gentle warmth, "what you've given us is beyond price. Our family, we were broken, incomplete. And now—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence as tears threatened to overwhelm her again. But the look in her eyes said everything that words couldn't. Hope restored, love renewed, a future that had seemed impossible suddenly stretching out before them. Jean stepped forward, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks as he processed what he had witnessed. "I always knew you could do it," he said with quiet conviction that carried the weight of absolute faith. "From the moment you made that promise years ago, I believed you would find a way." I couldn't help but laugh at that statement, the sound coming out as more of a wheeze given my current condition. "No, you didn't," I said with fond amusement, remembering the skeptical looks Jean had given me whenever I mentioned my intention to cure Rin's corruption. "You thought I was being naive at best, and dangerously delusional at worst." Jin's composure cracked further as a slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he admitted with uncharacteristic sheepishness, "perhaps I had some doubts about the feasibility of your approach." "Some doubts," I repeated with mock incredulity. "Jean, you spent half our conversations trying to convince me to focus on realistic goals instead of chasing impossible dreams." "I may have been overly cautious in my assessment of the situation," Jean conceded, his smile growing wider as the tension of the past few hours finally began to ease. "Though in my defense, what you just accomplished was objectively impossible according to every magical theory I've ever studied." "Impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet," I replied, settling back against the wall with a contented sigh. Despite my exhaustion, watching this family reunion unfold filled me with satisfaction that made every moment of strain worthwhile. Rin stirred slightly in her father's arms, consciousness slowly returning as the magical transformation completed its work within her system. Her eyes fluttered open with the careful uncertainty of someone waking from a very long dream, and for a moment she simply looked around the room as though trying to convince herself that what she was seeing was real. "Mother?" she whispered, her voice carrying wonder and disbelief in equal measure. "I'm here, sweetheart," Camilla replied immediately, moving to sit on the edge of the bed so she could stroke Rin's hair with gentle fingers. "We're all here. Father? Jean?" Rin's gaze moved between her family members, tears beginning to gather in her dark eyes as the reality of her situation finally registered. "This isn't a dream?" "No dream," Valen assured her, his own voice thick with emotion as he tightened his protective embrace. "You're awake. You're free. You're our daughter again." What followed was one of the most beautiful family reunions I had ever witnessed. 18 years of separation, guilt, and accumulated pain began to heal as the Ashbluff family rediscovered what it meant to be whole. They talked quietly among themselves, sharing memories and making tentative plans for a future none of them had dared to imagine just hours earlier. Rin's voice was soft and sometimes uncertain as she reacquainted herself with speaking to people who weren't hallucinations or products of her corrupted imagination. But with each passing minute, she seemed to grow more confident, more herself, as the reality of her freedom settled into her consciousness. I watched from my position against the wall, content to observe their happiness without intruding on what was clearly a private family moment. The exhaustion I felt was profound but oddly peaceful, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from completing something truly important. After perhaps an hour of quiet conversation and gentle reunion, Rin finally turned her attention toward me. Her expression grew serious as she carefully extracted herself from her family's protective circle and moved to sit on the edge of my chair. "Arthur," she said quietly, her voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present when speaking with her family. "I need to thank you properly." "You don't need to," I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Yes, I do," she said with quiet intensity. "What you did for me, what you risked. I spent 18 years believing I was beyond salvation, that I was nothing but a monster waiting to happen. And you proved that wrong." Her dark eyes, now clear of the corruption that had clouded them for so long, looked directly into mine with an intensity that spoke to absolute sincerity. "You gave me back my life," she continued, her voice beginning to tremble with emotion. "You gave me back my family. You gave me back my future. How do I even begin to repay something like that?" I studied her face for a moment, noting the genuine gratitude mixed with uncertainty about her place in the world. Despite being freed from the corruption, she still carried the psychological scars of 18 years of isolation and self-hatred. Those wounds would take time to heal completely. "You don't repay it," I said simply. "You live it. You take the second chance you've been given, and you use it to become the person you always wanted to be." "But I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered, vulnerability bleeding through her composed facade. "What if I mess this up? What if I hurt someone? What if—" "Rin," I interrupted gently, reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder with the same gesture I had used in her mindscape. "Do you know what I saw when I was fighting the corruption inside you?" She shook her head, confusion clear in her expression. "I saw someone who spent 18 years fighting against an alien influence that was trying to remake her into a weapon of mass destruction." I continued, my voice growing stronger despite my exhaustion. "Someone who held onto enough of herself to feel guilt about actions she couldn't control. Someone who was willing to die rather than risk hurting the people she loved." Rin's eyes widened as she processed my words. "The corruption didn't make you weak, Rin. It made surviving an act of incredible strength." I smiled softly as tears began to spill down her cheeks. "You endured 18 years of that torment and came out the other side still capable of love, still capable of hope, still fundamentally yourself despite everything that tried to change you." "I don't feel strong," she whispered, her voice breaking completely as the emotional weight of everything finally overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. "The strongest people rarely do," I replied with gentle understanding. "Strength isn't about feeling invincible. It's about continuing to fight even when you feel like giving up. It's about holding onto your humanity even when everything around you tries to strip it away. It's about choosing love over hatred, hope over despair, life over death." The tears were flowing freely now, but there was something different about them. Not the bitter tears of despair and self-hatred I had seen in her memories, but the cleansing tears of someone finally allowing themselves to grieve properly. "You survived something that would have broken most people completely," I continued, my voice soft but certain. "You kept enough of yourself intact that when salvation finally came, there was still someone worth saving. That's not weakness, Rin. That's incredible strength." "You really think so?" she asked through her tears, vulnerability making her voice small and uncertain. "I know so," I replied with absolute conviction. "And you should be proud of that strength. It's yours. It always was." Rin broke down completely then, 18 years of suppressed emotion pouring out in waves that made her whole body shake. But these weren't tears of anguish or despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of someone finally allowing themselves to feel hope for the future. I simply sat there with my hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort I could while she processed everything that had happened. Behind her, I could see her family watching with their own tears of joy and relief, understanding that this breakdown was necessary, a crucial step in her healing process. When the storm of emotion finally began to subside, Rin looked up at me with eyes that held something I hadn't seen in any of her memories or visions. Genuine peace. "Thank you," she said again. But this time the words carried different weight. Not just gratitude for being saved, but appreciation for being reminded of her own worth. I smiled softly, feeling my own sense of completion as I watched her begin to truly understand that she deserved the second chance she had been given. "You're going to be just fine, Rin Ashbluff," I said with quiet certainty. "You're stronger than you know." And for the first time in 18 years, she believed it. Chapter 8:22. Bet 1. After ensuring that Rin was stable and her family had time to process their miraculous reunion, I quietly excused myself from the Ashbluff estate. The sight of them together, truly together for the first time in 18 years, filled me with satisfaction that made every moment of strain worthwhile. But there were other matters that required my attention, and I had already imposed on their hospitality long enough. "Where are you going?" Jean asked as I prepared to leave, his diplomatic instincts recognizing that my departure carried more weight than a simple farewell. "To settle an old debt," I replied simply, adjusting Nixthar's position at my side. "There's someone I need to see at the western border." Valen looked up from where he sat beside Rin's bed, his enhanced senses no doubt detecting the subtle shift in my demeanor. "The Savage Communion?" I confirmed with a slight smile. "Don't worry about it. I'll be back before you know it." What I didn't mention was that this particular obligation had been weighing on my mind for years, ever since I had made a desperate gamble to save someone's life. The time had finally come to see whether my confidence in my own growth had been justified, or whether I had simply made a promise I couldn't keep. The journey to the western border took a simple warp. As I reached the frontier regions where the western continent met the contested territories controlled by various cult factions, I felt my anticipation building with each passing mile. The landscape below gradually transformed from the ordered farmlands and prosperous cities of the Ashbluff Kingdom into something more wild and dangerous. Fortified outposts dotted the terrain like islands of civilization in an increasingly hostile sea, while patrol routes carved visible paths through territories where magical beasts and cult infiltrators posed constant threats. Finally, I spotted my destination. The massive fortress complex that served as the western border's primary defensive installation. Fort Meridian had been built to withstand siege warfare on a continental scale, its walls reinforced with layers of protective enchantments, while massive artillery emplacements provided both magical and conventional firepower capable of repelling army-sized assaults. But more importantly, it was home to Grand Marshal Maylin Potton, the woman whose life I had saved years ago through a gamble that had seemed insane to everyone who witnessed it. I descended toward the fortress's central courtyard, my approach triggering immediate responses from the defensive systems. Alert signals blazed across the complex as guards rushed to their stations, but before any hostile action could be taken, a familiar voice cut through the chaos with commanding authority. "Stand down. All units, stand down immediately." Grand Marshal Maylin Potton emerged from the fortress's command structure with the kind of purposeful stride that had earned her recognition as one of the continent's most effective military leaders. Her navy blue hair was pulled back in the practical style favored by career soldiers, while her golden eyes carried the sharp intelligence that had allowed her to coordinate defensive operations across hundreds of miles of contested territory. She had changed since our last meeting, not just physically, though the years had added subtle lines around her eyes that spoke to the burden of constant vigilance, but in the confidence she projected. This was no longer the desperate officer who had faced certain death at the hands of an overwhelming enemy. This was a leader who had proven herself through countless battles and earned the absolute loyalty of everyone under her command. "Arthur Nightingale," she said as I touched down in the courtyard, her voice carrying a mixture of emotions too complex for simple categorization. "You actually returned." "I said I would," I replied with a slight smile, noting how her enhanced senses were no doubt cataloging the changes in my power level since our last encounter. "Though I have to admit, I'm a bit early." "Early?" Maylin's golden eyes widened as she processed the implications of my statement. "The duel isn't supposed to happen for another year." "I know," I said simply. But I'm confident enough in my growth that waiting seems unnecessary. Besides, I had business in the area anyway. The understatement made her laugh, a sound that carried genuine warmth despite the underlying tension of what my presence meant. Business in the area, right? I heard about your confrontation with King Valen. The entire border command is buzzing with reports about the sky being split in half. News travels fast, I observed with mild amusement. When someone demonstrates power that defies conventional understanding, people tend to talk about it, Mei Lin replied dryly. Though I have to say, seeing you now, the reports didn't do justice to how much you've changed. She wasn't wrong. The last time Mei Lin had seen me, I had been powerful for my age but still recognizably within normal parameters for magical development. Now, standing before her with capabilities that approached the legendary, I must have presented quite a contrast to her memories. You've grown too, I said, genuine respect coloring my voice as I observed the changes in her bearing and presence. Grand Marshal suits you. A slight flush colored her cheeks at the compliment, though her professional composure remained intact. I had good motivation to improve. When someone saves your life by promising to duel one of the world's most dangerous cult leaders, it tends to inspire personal development. About that, I said, my tone growing more serious. How have things been on the border? Any increased activity from the Savage Communion? Mei Lin's expression darkened slightly as she considered her response. Probing attacks, mostly. The Axe King seems to be testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses he can exploit when the time comes. But nothing like a full assault, yet. He's been waiting, I realized. We walked together toward the fortress's command center, her staff maintaining respectful distance while clearly curious about the legendary figure who had appeared so suddenly. As we moved through the corridors, Mei Lin's expression grew more thoughtful. I heard about Alara, she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss. The mention of my sixth fiancé's name brought a familiar pang of grief that I had learned to carry without letting it overwhelm me. Thank you, I replied simply. She would have liked you, I think. You both shared that stubborn refusal to back down from impossible odds. Is that why you're here early? Mei Lin asked with the kind of insight that had made her such an effective leader. Because waiting has become harder than acting? Partly, I admitted, but mostly because I've reached the point where I'm confident in the outcome. The Axe King is powerful, certainly, but it won't matter. Mei Lin studied my face with those sharp golden eyes, searching for any trace of doubt or uncertainty. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because her expression gradually shifted from concern to something approaching anticipation. So what's the plan? She asked as we reached her private office. March into Savage Communion territory and challenge him directly? Something like that, I said, moving toward the large windows that provided a view of the contested territories beyond the fortress walls. Though I think a more direct approach would be appropriate. Before Mei Lin could ask what I meant, I began to release the careful controls I maintained over my mana signature. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Waves of power radiated outward from my position, washing across the fortress and beyond with the kind of intensity that would be impossible to ignore. Every person with magical sensitivity within a 100-mile radius would feel that surge of energy, but only one individual would understand its true meaning. Arthur? Mei Lin said with growing alarm as she felt the sheer magnitude of power I was projecting. What are you doing? Calling him out? I replied calmly, my enhanced senses already detecting the response my challenge had provoked. He'll be here within minutes. Here? You're going to fight him here. The fortress is well protected, I pointed out. Your people will be safe behind the barriers, and will have plenty of room to settle things properly. As if summoned by my words, a new presence appeared on the edge of my perception, massive, violent, and radiating the kind of bloodthirsty anticipation that spoke to years of waiting for this moment. The Axe King was coming, and he was bringing everything he had. Get your people to safety, I said, moving back toward the courtyard, while Nixthar hummed with anticipation at my side. This won't take long. The air itself seemed to thicken as something enormous approached the fortress at tremendous speed. Windows rattled in their frames while the very ground began to vibrate under the pressure of an approaching force that defied easy classification. Then he appeared. The Axe King materialized above the fortress in an explosion of violent energy that made the sky itself seem to recoil. He was exactly as I remembered from our previous encounter. A giant of a man whose very presence radiated barely controlled savagery. His massive frame wrapped in armor that looked like it had been forged from the bones of fallen gods. In his hands, he carried the weapon that had earned him his title. An axe of such immense proportions that it seemed more like a natural disaster given physical form. The blade gleamed with malevolent energy while runes of destruction pulsed along its edge, promising devastation beyond mortal comprehension. His eyes found me in the courtyard below, and the smile that spread across his scarred features was the stuff of nightmares. This was someone who lived for violence, who found joy in destruction, who had spent 8 years anticipating the moment when he could finally test himself against someone worthy of his full attention. Chapter 8:23. Bet. 2. The massive axe descended through the air like a falling star, its trajectory aimed directly at the courtyard where I stood. Vorgoth Ironmaw, the Axe King, had put everything behind this opening strike, the kind of devastating attack that had ended countless battles before they could truly begin. The weapon's edge gleamed with miasma and axe unity while the very air seemed to split before its passage, creating a wake of distorted space that spoke to forces beyond conventional understanding. I had been prepared to meet the strike head-on, my hand already moving toward Nixthar's hilt while my enhanced reflexes calculated the optimal angle for deflection. This was exactly the kind of straightforward challenge I had expected from someone whose reputation was built on overwhelming force rather than subtle technique. What I hadn't expected was for Mei Lin to suddenly appear between the descending axe and its intended target. "Mei Lin, no," I called out, but she was already in motion, her own weapon materializing in her hands with practiced efficiency. Her scythe was a work of art in its own right, a weapon forged specifically for someone of her capabilities and enhanced with enchantments that reflected years of accumulated battle experience. The curved blade gleamed with silver light while intricate runes ran along its shaft, marking it as a weapon worthy of someone who had earned the rank of Grand Marshal through merit rather than politics. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft, her stance shifting into perfect defensive positioning, while her golden eyes tracked the axe's approach with analytical precision. But even as I watched her prepare to intercept the strike, I could see the fundamental problem with what she was attempting. Mei Lin was powerful, high immortal rank, with combat experience that few could match and technique refined through countless battles. Under normal circumstances, she would have been more than capable of deflecting or redirecting an attack from most opponents, regardless of their reputation or classification. But Vorgoth Ironmaw wasn't most opponents. The Axe King was one of the 5 cult leaders, beings whose power approached the legendary, while their willingness to embrace corruption and destruction removed most of the moral limitations that constrained conventional combatants. His strength was in the low radiant rank category, with decades of experience fighting opponents who possessed capabilities that defied easy categorization. Mei Lin's scythe met the axe's edge with a sound like thunder splitting the heavens, silver light clashing against malevolent darkness in a display that would have been visible from miles away. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though her defensive technique might succeed in redirecting the devastating attack. Then Vorgoth poured more power into his strike. The additional force wasn't subtle or gradual. It was an explosion of violent energy that transformed what had been a powerful but manageable attack into something approaching a natural disaster. Dark mana erupted around the axe's blade like liquid shadow given physical form, while the weapon's enchantments blazed with renewed intensity that spoke to their creator's willingness to embrace any cost for the sake of absolute destruction. I watched in slow motion as Mei Lin's defensive stance began to buckle under the overwhelming pressure. Her scythe, despite its quality and her considerable skill, simply wasn't designed to handle forces of this magnitude. Hairline cracks appeared along the weapon's shaft, while the protective enchantments that should have absorbed the impact started to flicker and fail. Her golden eyes widened with shocked recognition as she realized that her strength, considerable though it was, had been insufficient for the task she had attempted. The axe continued its descent, its trajectory barely altered by her intervention, while her defensive position crumbled under the weight of absolute power. But I was already moving. Nixdar cleared its sheath in a single fluid motion, the legendary blade singing with anticipation as I channeled everything I had learned during my time in the demon realm. Soul resonance flooded my system with enhanced capabilities while lucent harmony synchronized my magical channels for optimal efficiency. Seraphim's embrace wrapped me in protective energy that made my skin shine with subtle radiance, while every technique I had mastered combined into perfect unity of purpose. I reached Malin's position just as her scythe finally succumbed to the overwhelming force bearing down upon it. The weapon shattered like glass, fragments of enchanted metal scattering across the courtyard, while she stumbled backward with shock clear in her expression. My left arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against my side while my right hand brought Nixdar up in a perfect defensive arc. The timing was precise to the microsecond. Any later and the axe would have completed its devastating trajectory. Any earlier and I wouldn't have been in position to provide the support Malin needed. Vorgotha's massive weapon met Nixdar's edge with an impact that shook the very foundations of Fort Meridian. The collision should have been catastrophic. The Axe King's strike carried enough force to level city blocks, channeled through a weapon that had carved through legendary defenses and shattered the strongest fortifications. By every reasonable calculation, the impact should have sent both Malin and me flying across the courtyard while the fortress itself suffered structural damage from the residual energy. Instead, I didn't budge so much as an inch. Nixdar held the massive axe motionless above our heads, its edgeless blade somehow perfectly positioned to catch and contain forces that should have been beyond any single weapon's ability to manage. The legendary sword hummed with satisfaction, its ancient enchantments responding to the challenge with the kind of enthusiasm that spoke to a weapon forged for exactly this type of confrontation. Around us, the air itself seemed to hold its breath as the impossible sight registered on everyone present. Vorgotha's eyes widened with genuine shock as he processed what had just occurred, while his massive frame trembled with the effort of maintaining pressure against an immovable object. But it was Malin's reaction that caught my attention most completely. She stared up at me with golden eyes wide with disbelief, her enhanced senses no doubt working frantically to understand how someone who hadn't yet reached quasi-radiant rank could casually stop an attack that had shattered her own legendary-grade weapon. Her proximity to my position meant she could feel the controlled power radiating from my form, could sense the careful balance of forces that allowed me to make this kind of demonstration look effortless. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling energy that surrounded Vorgotha's still-pressing axe. "Your mana signature. You're not even radiant rank yet. This should be impossible." I smiled slightly, appreciating her analytical approach even in the midst of such dramatic circumstances. "Rankings are just numbers," I said quietly, my voice carrying easily despite the supernatural forces at play around us. "They don't account for everything that matters in real combat." To emphasize the point, I shifted my grip on Nixdar slightly and applied just a fraction more force to my defensive stance. Vorgotha's axe, which had been straining against my blade with tremendous pressure, suddenly found itself being pushed backward with casual ease. The Axe King snarled with frustrated rage as he realized that his opening gambit, the attack he had been planning and anticipating for 8 years, had been not just stopped but dominated by someone he had expected to crush through sheer overwhelming force. "Retreat," I whispered to Malin, my lips close enough to her ear that the words wouldn't carry to our opponent. "Get your people to safety and leave this to me." Malin searched my face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty, her golden eyes reflecting the kind of sharp intelligence that had earned her command of the western frontier. Whatever she found in my expression seemed to convince her that arguing would be both futile and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. "Don't you dare lose," she said fiercely, her voice carrying the kind of absolute command that had made grown soldiers leap to obey her orders. "I didn't spend 8 years worrying about this duel just to watch you get yourself killed through overconfidence." "I don't plan to," I replied with genuine warmth, appreciating her concern while simultaneously preparing for what came next. "But you need to trust me on this." She nodded reluctantly, her military discipline overriding personal inclinations as she recognized the tactical reality of the situation. With careful movements that spoke to years of combat experience, she extracted herself from my protective embrace and began retreating toward the fortress's main structure. "All units, full withdrawal to secondary positions," she commanded, her voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority. "Establish defensive perimeter around the command center and await further orders." Chapter 8:24. Bet. 3. With the courtyard cleared of everyone except myself and Vorgoth Ironmaw, I finally had the space to properly assess my opponent without worrying about collateral damage. The Axe King stood before me in all his terrifying glory, a giant of a man whose very presence radiated the kind of barely controlled violence that had made him one of the world's most feared cult leaders. His massive frame was wrapped in armor that looked like it had been forged from the bones of fallen gods, while scars crisscrossed every visible inch of his skin in patterns that spoke to decades of brutal combat. The axe in his hands was easily the size of a small building, its blade pulsing with malevolent energy, while runes of destruction glowed along its edge like dying stars. Seraphim's Embrace activated, sharpening my enhanced senses to perfect clarity. Through this combination of abilities, I could analyze Vorgoth's power structure with crystalline precision. The realization was both expected and disappointing. Vorgoth Ironmaw was significantly weaker than King Valen Ashbluff. Several years ago, when I had made that desperate gamble to save Malin's life, the Axe King had seemed like an insurmountable challenge, a force of nature that would require everything I could possibly develop to defeat. Now, with my senses revealing the true extent of his capabilities, I could see that he was strong but ultimately limited. Vorgoth was low Radiant rank with decades of combat experience and a willingness to embrace destruction that removed most moral constraints. But Valen had been mid-Radiant rank with perfect technical mastery and the kind of desperate motivation that came from protecting everything he held dear. The difference was significant enough to fundamentally alter my approach to this confrontation. "Are you going to stand there analyzing me all day, boy?" Vorgoth snarled, his scarred features twisting into an expression of savage anticipation. "Or are we going to settle this properly?" "Just making sure I understand what I'm dealing with," I replied calmly, allowing Lucent Harmony to synchronize my magical channels for optimal efficiency. I wouldn't want to accidentally end this too quickly. The Axe King's eyes narrowed at what he clearly interpreted as an insult, miasma beginning to coil around his massive frame like living shadow. "Arrogant little shit," he growled, raising his weapon with both hands. "Let's see how confident you are when I'm wearing your entrails as jewelry." He launched himself forward with explosive force, his enhanced speed creating sonic booms that shattered what remained of the courtyard's decorative elements. The axe came down in a devastating arc that carried enough power to split mountains, while his battle cry echoed across the fortress with the kind of primal fury that had broken the will of countless opponents. I met his charge without flinching, Nixthar rising to intercept the massive weapon with surgical precision. When the blades met, the impact sent shockwaves radiating outward that cracked the reinforced stone beneath our feet and made the fortress walls tremble with residual energy. But unlike my battle with Valen, I didn't need to activate every enhancement at my disposal. Mythic Body provided more than enough physical strength to match Vorgoth's capabilities, while my perfected technique allowed me to redirect his overwhelming force with minimal effort. "What?" he gasped as his axe was deflected away from its intended target, his momentum carrying him past me while I remained perfectly balanced. "You're strong," I acknowledged, turning to face him as he recovered from the failed strike. "But strength without precision is just noise." To demonstrate the point, I shifted into the first movement of my Grade 6 art, Godflash. Nixthar moved in a silver arc that seemed to bend space around its passage, the strike arriving at Vorgoth's position before he could properly register that I had moved. The legendary blade carved through his bone armor like it was made of paper, opening a shallow cut across his chest that would have been fatal if I had put more force behind the technique. "Impossible," he snarled, staggering backward while dark blood seeped through the crack in his protection. "You're not even Radiant rank. How are you?" Godflash. Absolute. The enhanced version of my technique struck before he could finish the question, Nixthar's edge finding the gap in his defenses with mathematical precision. This time the cut was deeper, carving through layers of enhanced bone and corrupted flesh, while the Axe King's own momentum worked against his attempts to evade. "Rankings are just numbers," I said, echoing my earlier words to Mei Lin while preparing for the next exchange. "They don't account for actual capability or refined technique." Vorgoth roared with frustrated rage as he realized that his reputation and raw power were insufficient against someone who had developed beyond conventional classification systems. Dark mana erupted around him in waves that made the very air seem to recoil, while his axe blazed with renewed intensity as he channeled everything he possessed into a devastating counterattack. The weapon came at me in a whirlwind of destruction, each strike carrying enough force to level city blocks, while his enhanced speed pushed his movements beyond what most observers could track. It was an impressive display of violence that would have overwhelmed the vast majority of opponents he had faced throughout his career. But I had fought King Valen Ashbluff, a man whose technical mastery and desperate motivation had pushed me to the very limits of my capabilities. Compared to that life-or-death struggle against someone who possessed both superior power and perfect technique, Vorgoth's assault felt almost manageable. I wove between his attacks with fluid grace, Nixthar deflecting the strikes I couldn't avoid while Soul Vision tracked every movement with perfect clarity. Where Valen had forced me to activate my domain and use gray power, the Axe King's assault required only my basic enhancement techniques. "Hold still, you slippery bastard," Vorgoth bellowed, frustration bleeding through his savage demeanor as strike after strike failed to connect with anything more substantial than empty air. "Why would I do that?" I asked conversationally, using the second movement of my grade 6 art to demonstrate my point. Hollow Eclipse. The technique created a void-like cutting force that severed a section of his axe's handle, the weapon suddenly becoming unbalanced as part of its structure was cleanly removed. Vorgoth stared in shock at his suddenly damaged weapon, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. "What did you do to my axe?" he demanded, genuine alarm creeping into his voice for the first time since our confrontation began. "Showed you the difference between raw power and refined technique," I replied, settling into position for what I already knew would be the final exchange of our battle. The Axe King's face contorted with desperate fury as he realized that everything he had built his reputation on was proving insufficient against an opponent who operated according to different rules entirely. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the fortress, he channeled every ounce of power he possessed into one last devastating assault. Dark mana coalesced around his damaged weapon in layers that transformed it from a simple axe into something approaching a force of nature. The blade, despite being partially severed, blazed with malevolent energy while reality itself seemed to bend around its edge. This was the technique that had earned him his fearsome reputation, the attack that had broken armies and shattered the defenses of the strongest fortifications. I watched the approaching devastation with calm analytical interest, noting through Soul Vision the way he had managed to compensate for his weapon's damage through sheer force of will and accumulated power. It was impressive work that demonstrated why he had earned his position among the cult leaders, even if it ultimately fell short of what would be required to challenge me seriously. As the enhanced axe reached the peak of its destructive potential, I shifted into the third movement of my grade 6 art, Stellar Cascade. The technique manifested as a downward waterfall of cutting energy, each strike flowing into the next with perfect precision. Vorgoth's ultimate attack met my cascade head-on, the collision creating a brief moment where competing forces of annihilation struggled for dominance. Then my technique overwhelmed his completely. The cascade tore through his enhanced axe, his bone armor, and finally the man himself with surgical precision that left no room for survival or last-minute escapes. Vorgoth Ironmaw, the Axe King, one of the 5 cult leaders, terror of the western frontier, fell before forces that operated beyond his ability to comprehend or resist. His body collapsed to the cracked stone of the courtyard. The fearsome reputation that had taken decades to build extinguished in a matter of minutes by someone who hadn't even needed to reveal the full extent of his capabilities. I stood over his remains for a moment, feeling oddly melancholy about how anticlimactic the confrontation had proven to be. 8 years ago, this man had represented an impossible challenge. a goal so distant that reaching it seemed like pure fantasy. Now, with perspective granted by battles against beings who could reshape reality with their will alone, he felt almost small. "It's finished," I said quietly, my words carrying across the courtyard to where Mei Lin and her soldiers waited behind the fortress's protective barriers. Chapter 8:25. Bet 4. Gideon Ironmaw stood at the highest tower of the Savage Communion's fortress, his hands gripping the stone balustrade with enough force to crack the reinforced material. His golden eyes, so similar to his father's, stared westward toward the distant border, where he knew the confrontation that would determine his future was about to unfold. Today was the day. After years of anticipation, the duel between his father and Arthur Nightingale would finally take place. "Young master," came a hesitant voice from behind him, "perhaps you should reconsider." "He's already gone." Gideon cut off his advisor without turning around, his voice carrying the kind of bitter resignation that had settled over him like a shroud. "Father felt Arthur's mana signature an hour ago and left immediately, despite every council member begging him to wait for backup." The elderly cult member who served as one of Gideon's strategic advisors stepped closer, his weathered face creased with worry. "The Axe King is one of the 5 cult leaders. Surely against a single opponent, even one as notorious as Arthur Nightingale." "You don't understand," Gideon interrupted again, his knuckles whitening as his grip on the stone intensified. "None of you understand what we're dealing with." He could still remember that day almost 4 years ago when he had been foolish enough to challenge Arthur Nightingale directly. At the time, Gideon had been riding high on his reputation as the heir to one of the world's most feared cult organizations, confident in his abilities and certain that his superior mana rank would carry him to victory. Arthur had been 2 full mana levels below him then, a significant gap that should have made the outcome a foregone conclusion. Gideon had possessed every advantage: better equipment, superior training from cult masters, and the kind of ruthless mindset that came from growing up in an organization dedicated to human extinction. Arthur hadn't just defeated him. He had made it look effortless, dismantling Gideon's techniques with casual precision while demonstrating capabilities that defied every conventional understanding of magical development. Now, for years later, they were at the same mana rank, quasi-radiant for both of them, according to every measurement system the cult possessed. But if anything, that knowledge made Gideon feel even more hopeless about their comparative abilities. If Arthur could dominate him while being 2 levels weaker, what chance did Gideon have now that the gap in raw power had been eliminated? How much stronger had Arthur become during those same 4 years that Gideon had spent desperately trying to catch up? The reports from the border conflicts suggest that Arthur Nightingale, while dangerous, is still within the parameters that Father can handle, the advisor said carefully, clearly trying to provide reassurance while navigating the treacherous waters of Gideon's volatile mood. "The reports are wrong," Gideon replied flatly. "They're all wrong because they're based on conventional assumptions about how power works. Arthur doesn't follow those rules." A sudden spike of alarm shot through Gideon's consciousness as his connection to his father, a bond forged through years of cult rituals and shared black mana, flickered with distress. For a moment, he felt Vorgotha's shock and confusion as something unexpected occurred during the confrontation. Then the connection went dead. Gideon's breath caught in his throat as the implications crashed over him like a physical blow. The bond between father and son, strengthened by decades of mutual corruption and shared purpose, couldn't be severed by distance or interference. Could only be broken by one thing: death. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible as his enhanced senses confirmed what his heart already knew. "No, it can't be." But even as denial formed on his lips, he could feel the truth settling into his consciousness like acid. Vorgoth Ironmaw, the Axe King, one of the 5 cult leaders, the man who had carved his reputation from the bones of fallen kingdoms, was dead. Killed by Arthur Nightingale with such efficiency that the battle had lasted only minutes. "Young master?" the advisor asked with growing alarm as he noticed the change in Gideon's demeanor. "What's wrong?" Gideon bit his lower lip hard enough to draw blood, the metallic taste mixing with the bitter rage that was building in his chest like a volcanic eruption. His father was dead. The man who had trained him, shaped him, prepared him to inherit leadership of the Savage Communion, had been killed by the same person who had humiliated Gideon so thoroughly 4 years ago. "He's gone," Gideon said quietly, his voice carrying a hollow quality that made the advisor step backward instinctively. "Father is dead." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, their implications rippling outward through the fortress as other cult members began to sense the disturbance in the magical currents that connected their organization. Whispers and gasps echoed from the floors below as the reality of their situation became clear. The Savage Communion had lost its leader, and the person responsible for that loss was still very much alive. "We must rally the remaining forces," the advisor said with the kind of desperate urgency that came from recognizing an existential threat. "Contact the other cult leaders. Coordinate a response." "With what?" Gideon snarled, whirling to face the elderly man with eyes that blazed with frustrated fury. "Father was the strongest among us, and Arthur killed him like he was nothing. What makes you think the rest of us would fare any better?" The advisor's face paled as he processed the full scope of what Gideon was saying. If the heir to the Savage Communion, someone who had spent his entire life preparing to fight humanity's greatest champions, believed their cause was hopeless, then what hope did any of them have? Gideon turned back to the balustrade, his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and impotent rage as he stared toward the distant border where his father's body now lay cooling in the fortress courtyard. The man who had seemed invincible throughout Gideon's childhood, who had represented the pinnacle of what corrupted power could achieve, had been reduced to a corpse in a matter of minutes. "I'm not strong enough," he whispered, the admission tearing at his throat like broken glass. "Even with everything Father taught me, even with years of preparation, I'm not strong enough to avenge him." The realization was perhaps the most bitter pill he had ever been forced to swallow. Gideon had always known that Arthur was dangerous, but some part of him had clung to the hope that time and training would eventually close the gap between them. Now, with his father's death serving as definitive proof of Arthur's capabilities, that hope crumbled into dust. He was quasi-radiant rank, just like Arthur. By every conventional measure, they should have been evenly matched. But Gideon knew with absolute certainty that if he faced Arthur again, the outcome would be exactly the same as 4 years ago. Only this time, Arthur might not show mercy. "Young master," the advisor said hesitantly, "perhaps it would be wise to consider strategic withdrawal? The other cult territories could run." Gideon's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Hide in some distant corner of the world while Arthur picks apart everything Father built? While he systematically hunts down everyone I've ever cared about? It would be temporary," the advisor insisted, "until we can find a way to match his power, or—" "There is no way," Gideon said with finality that cut through the man's desperate optimism. "Not through conventional means. Not through training or artifacts or clever alliances. Arthur has transcended those limitations entirely." As the words left his mouth, Gideon felt something settle over him like a shroud, a depth of despair so profound that it made his earlier grief seem shallow by comparison. His father was dead. His organization was doomed. Everyone he had sworn to protect would eventually fall to Arthur's inexorable advance. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I need power," he thought desperately, his consciousness reaching out into the void that surrounded his shattered hopes. Real power, the kind that can match monsters like Arthur Nightingale. But how? How does someone like me find strength that can challenge the impossible? As if summoned by his desperation, a voice spoke directly into his mind. Not through his ears, but through some deeper channel that bypassed his physical senses entirely. "Do you truly wish for power, young one?" Gideon's head snapped up, his enhanced senses searching frantically for the source of the communication. But there was nothing, no magical signature, no physical presence, no indication of where the voice might be originating. "Power to destroy those who have wronged you? Power to remake this world according to your vision? Power to transcend the limitations that have held you back?" "Who are you?" Gideon whispered, his voice barely audible as every instinct he possessed screamed warnings about the nature of what was speaking to him. "I am opportunity." I am possibility. I am the answer to your prayers, if you possess the will to embrace what must be done. The advisor and other cult members present showed no sign of hearing the voice, their expressions confused as they watched Gideon apparently speaking to empty air. But Gideon could feel the presence now, something vast and ancient and utterly alien pressing against the edges of his consciousness. "What kind of power?" he asked, his voice growing stronger as desperate hope began to kindle in the depths of his despair. "The power to destroy worlds. The power to unmake reality itself. The power to reduce your enemies to less than memory." Gideon's breath caught in his throat as the implications of what was being offered crashed over him. This wasn't just about gaining strength. This was about accessing forces that operated beyond anything the current world had ever seen. "What's the price?" he asked, because even in his desperation, he retained enough cunning to understand that offers like this never came without cost. "Only your willingness to embrace what you must become, to cast aside the limitations of your humanity and ascend to something greater, something necessary." The young cult leader closed his eyes, his mind racing through the alternatives available to him. He could flee, as his advisor suggested, and spend the rest of his life running from Arthur's eventual pursuit. He could try to rally the remaining cult forces and launch conventional attacks that would inevitably fail. He could surrender and hope that Arthur would show mercy to a defeated enemy. Or he could accept this offer and gain the power necessary to make Arthur pay for everything he had taken. "Yes," Gideon said quietly, opening his eyes to stare directly into the empty air where he sensed the presence waiting. "I want that power. I want the strength to destroy Arthur Nightingale and everything he represents." The space around him crushed inward like a collapsing star, and the last air of the savage communion disappeared into possibilities that defied human understanding. Chapter 8:26 Infernal Armis 1. The journey back to the Ashbluff Palace took on a vastly different tone than my earlier departure. Where I had left alone with grim purpose, I now returned accompanied by Grand Marshal Malin Potton, whose presence served as living proof that the western frontier's greatest threat had finally been eliminated. Malin flew beside me with the kind of controlled grace that spoke to years of aerial combat experience, her navy blue hair streaming behind her while her golden eyes remained fixed on the approaching capital. She had insisted on accompanying me to deliver the news personally, claiming that reports of the Axe King's death needed to come from someone whose authority couldn't be questioned. "Are you certain you're ready for this?" I asked as the familiar spires of the royal palace came into view. "The political implications of Vorgotha's death are going to ripple across the entire continent." "I've been preparing for this moment for years," Malin replied with quiet determination. "The western frontier can finally begin planning for expansion rather than just survival. That's worth any amount of political complexity." We descended toward the palace grounds, our approach immediately triggering responses from the enhanced security systems that had been implemented since my earlier confrontation with Valen. Guards rushed to positions along the walls while sensors swept us with identification protocols, though the alerts died away quickly as our identities were confirmed. King Valen emerged from the main palace structure before we had even fully landed, his enhanced senses no doubt having detected our approach from miles away. His expression carried the kind of carefully controlled anticipation that spoke to a ruler who understood that unexpected visits from powerful individuals rarely brought simple news. "Arthur," he said as I touched down in the courtyard, his gray eyes immediately shifting to assess Malin's presence. "Grand Marshal Potton, this is unexpected." "Your Majesty," Malin replied with crisp military formality, bowing slightly while maintaining the bearing of someone delivering information of critical importance. "I come bearing news from the western frontier." "The duel," Valen said with immediate understanding, his gaze returning to me with sharp intensity. "It's finished. Vorgoth Ironmaw is dead," I confirmed simply, noting how the words seemed to hit Valen with almost physical force despite his composed demeanor. For a moment, the king of the western continent simply stared at me, processing the implications of what I had just announced. The Axe King had been one of the 5 cult leaders. His death represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would affect every aspect of continental politics. "How?" Valen asked finally, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that came from recognizing that the answer might be more significant than the simple fact of victory. Quickly, I replied with deliberate understatement. He was strong. Mei Lin stepped forward, her golden eyes reflecting the kind of professional satisfaction that came from witnessing the elimination of a long-standing threat. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes, Your Majesty. Arthur dominated the confrontation from the beginning. 10 minutes? Valen repeated slowly, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications of such an overwhelming victory. Against one of the 5 cult leaders. The continent owes you a debt beyond measure, Arthur. With the Axe King dead, the Western frontier can finally. I was simply upholding an oath. I interrupted gently but firmly. 7 years ago, I made a promise to duel Vorgoth in exchange for Grand Marshal Potten's life. That debt has now been settled. Still, Valen insisted, genuine gratitude bleeding through his royal composure. What you've accomplished will save countless lives. The Savage Communion's expansion has been checked, and their leadership structure has been severely damaged. That comment sparked a train of thought that had been developing during my flight back to the capital. With Vorgoth dead and the cult's primary military leader eliminated, this represented an ideal opportunity to address the broader threat they pose to continental stability. About that, I said, my tone growing more serious as I considered the strategic implications. With the Axe King gone, the Savage Communion has lost their most effective pope. This might be the perfect time for a coordinated assault on their remaining strongholds. Valen's eyes sharpened with immediate interest. You're suggesting a full campaign against their territories? I'm suggesting that you coordinate such a campaign, I clarified, noting how both Valen and Mei Lin leaned forward slightly at the distinction. The Western continent has the military resources and strategic position to roll up their remaining installations before they can reorganize under new leadership. And you? Mei Lin asked with obvious concern. Surely your participation would be crucial for ensuring success against their remaining cult leaders. I shook my head with a slight smile. My work here is finished. I've honored my obligations to both the Ashbluff family and the Western frontier. Now I need to return home with Stella and focus on other matters that require my attention. We moved into the palace proper as our conversation continued, the familiar corridors now feeling oddly peaceful after the various confrontations that had taken place over the past few days. Servants and guards bowed respectfully as we passed, though I noted how their deference carried a different quality now. Recognition of someone whose capabilities had been definitively proven rather than simple acknowledgement of rank or reputation. The intelligence network suggests that without Vorgoth's direct leadership, the remaining cult territories will likely fracture into competing factions. Mei Lin observed as we entered one of the palace's strategic planning chambers. If we move quickly, we can prevent them from consolidating under unified command. Exactly, Valen agreed, his mind clearly already working through deployment schedules and resource allocation. A series of coordinated strikes over the next 6 months could break their remaining power permanently. I nodded approvingly at their strategic thinking, satisfied that the Western frontier would be in capable hands after my departure. Both Valen and Mei Lin possessed the experience and resources necessary to handle threats that operated through conventional means, even if those threats remained dangerous to normal military forces. When do you plan to leave? Valen asked, turning his attention back to me with an expression that mixed understanding with genuine regret. Within the next few days, I replied. I want to make sure Rin is fully stabilized in her recovery, and Stella has been patient about extending our visit longer than originally planned. She's remarkable, your daughter, Mei Lin commented with the kind of genuine warmth that spoke to someone who genuinely appreciated exceptional individuals. Her composure during the border crisis was unusual for someone her age. Stella has had to adapt to circumstances that most children never face, I said with paternal pride mixed with slight concern about the responsibilities she had been forced to shoulder. Though I try to ensure she has as normal a childhood as possible. We continued discussing various aspects of the planned campaign against the Savage Communion, with Valen and Maylin working through tactical considerations while I offered occasional insights based on my understanding of cult operations and leadership structures. The conversation was both productive and oddly relaxing, the kind of strategic planning session that reminded me why I valued competent allies even when I could handle most threats directly. Then something changed. It started as a subtle shift in the ambient mana levels around the palace, the kind of disturbance that enhanced senses could detect but normal perception might miss entirely. Both Valen and I straightened immediately, our conversation dying as we focused on identifying the source of the anomaly. "Do you feel that?" Valen asked, his voice carrying the kind of tension that came from recognizing potential danger without being able to identify its nature. "Yes," I confirmed, my enhanced senses reaching out to analyze the growing disturbance. The sensation continued to build, layers of energy accumulating in patterns that spoke to forces operating on a scale that dwarfed most magical phenomena. Through our mental link, I felt Luna's attention snap to full alertness as she detected the same anomalous readings. "Arthur," her voice carried urgent concern, "this energy signature, it's not from this world." Before I could respond to her warning, the disturbance reached a crescendo that made every enhanced individual in the palace grounds stagger under its intensity. Outside the windows, we could see a streak of light blazing across the sky. Not a meteor or natural phenomenon, but something artificial that moved with purposeful trajectory. Whatever it was impacted the Earth perhaps 50 miles from the capital, the force of its arrival sending shockwaves through the ground that rattled the palace's foundations despite the distance involved. "What in the name of the gods was that?" Valen demanded, his enhanced senses clearly struggling to process readings that defied easy categorization. But even as he spoke, recognition was dawning in my consciousness, as Luna's memories provided context for what we had just witnessed. The original Arthur had told us about artifacts like this, objects of power so immense that they existed partially outside normal spacetime, appearing in various worlds and eras according to patterns that defied conventional understanding. "That," I said quietly, my voice carrying a mixture of awe and growing concern, "was a mythical-grade artifact making planetfall." "Mythical grade," Valen repeated, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications of such a classification. "I thought those were theoretical constructs." "Not theoretical," Luna confirmed through our mental link, her ancient knowledge providing details that made my blood run cold. "That's Infernal Armis, one of the 7 artifacts that swim through spacetime itself, appearing wherever reality grows thin enough to permit their passage." "What kind of artifact?" Maylin asked, though her military instincts were clearly screaming warnings about the nature of what had just arrived on their world. I stared out the window toward the distant impact site, my enhanced vision detecting the pillar of otherworldly light that now rose from the crater like a beacon calling to every power-hungry individual on the continent. The Artifact of Ruin. Chapter 8:27. Infernal Armis. 2. The palace's strategic command center had been hastily converted into a crisis management facility, its walls lined with holographic displays that showed satellite feeds from the impact site. The Infernal Armis rested at the center of a massive crater that extended far beyond the border of the western continent into the land of the Savage Communion, its presence bending spacetime around it like a predator coiling its claws around its prey, in this case, reality. "Seriously, what the hell is that thing?" Callie demanded, her dark eyes fixed on the main display where distorted space rippled in impossible patterns around the artifact. Her usual composure had given way to obvious unease at the sheer wrongness of what they were observing. "A mythical-grade artifact," I replied grimly, studying the way reality seemed to bend and flex around the fallen object. "One of 7 that swim through spacetime itself, appearing wherever the barriers between worlds grow thin enough to permit their passage. Mythical-grade artifacts weren't created nor limited to one world like lower-grade artifacts. They were on another level entirely." Jean stepped closer to the display, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. "The energy readings are beyond anything our sensors can properly measure. It's as though the artifact exists partially outside normal dimensional space." "That's because it does," I confirmed, noting how even the advanced magical technology struggled to process readings that defied conventional understanding. The Infernal Armis doesn't just possess power. It fundamentally alters the laws of magic in its immediate vicinity, something like a gift but on a larger scale. Rin, who had been quietly observing from beside her parents, spoke up with careful curiosity. "Is it dangerous to approach?" "Extremely," I said, my enhanced senses detecting the way the artifact's influence was already spreading outward from the impact site. "But not in the way you might expect. The Infernal Armis isn't actively hostile. It's selective. It will test anyone who attempts to claim it, and those tests will be designed to kill anyone it deems unworthy." Maylin frowned as she processed the tactical implications. "What kind of tests are we talking about? Military challenges? Combat trials?" "The artifact of carnage," Luna's voice whispered through our mental link, her ancient knowledge providing context that made my blood run cold. "Its trials will reflect its nature: brutality, endurance, the willingness to destroy anything that stands in your way." Before I could relay Luna's warning to the others, something fundamental shifted in the energy patterns surrounding the distant artifact. Through my enhanced perception, I felt a sudden spike of activity as the Infernal Armis's selective process reached some kind of conclusion. "No," I breathed, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "It's choosing someone." "What do you mean?" Valen demanded, his gray eyes sharpening with immediate alarm. "The artifact has found a candidate it considers worthy," I explained, my voice growing more urgent as I felt the distant energy signature beginning to stabilize around a single focal point. "Someone is being granted access to its trials right now." Through our mental connection, Luna's warning struck my consciousness with devastating clarity. "Arthur, I'm detecting something else. The Heavenly Demon's power signature. It's re-emerging. Stronger than before." The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave of dread. If the Heavenly Demon's influence was somehow connected to whoever was approaching the Infernal Armis, then we weren't just looking at the birth of a new artifact wielder. We were witnessing the emergence of what would become known as the Second Calamity. "We need to move," Valen said with the kind of decisive authority that had made him an effective ruler. "Strike teams, immediate deployment. If we can reach the artifact before—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head as I processed the tactical realities of what we were facing. "We can't break through the protective shell that forms around a mythical-grade artifact during its selection process. Our combined power isn't sufficient to breach that kind of defense." "Then what do you suggest?" Callie asked, frustration bleeding through her controlled demeanor. "We just sit here and watch while someone claims an artifact that could reshape the continental balance of power?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect millions of lives pressing down on my shoulders. My original plan had been to leave the cleanup of the Savage Communion to the Ashbluff family while I returned home with Stella. But the arrival of the Infernal Armis had fundamentally changed the equation. This wasn't something I could delegate to others, no matter how capable they might be. And if the Heavenly Demon's power was somehow involved, then this situation had implications that went far beyond regional politics. "I haven't even reached Radiant rank yet," I thought with growing concern, my enhanced senses cataloging the immense energies swirling around the distant artifact. "If whoever claims the Infernal Armis gains demigod-level capabilities, can I really face them with my current strength?" But even as doubt crept into my mind, I knew there was no choice. The responsibility had fallen to me, regardless of whether I felt ready for it. "I need to make some calls," I said finally, reaching for the communication crystal that would connect me to my most trusted allies. "This isn't something the Western continent can handle alone." "Who are you calling?" Maylin asked with obvious curiosity. "The people I trust most in this world," I replied, channeling mana into the crystal while preparing to send messages across continental distances. 5 women who have stood with me through impossible odds and whose strength I know absolutely. The first connection established quickly, Cecilia's familiar presence filtering through the magical link with warm recognition. "Arthur? What's wrong? I can feel your tension from here." I need you in the Western continent, I said without preamble. Mythical-grade artifact, potential calamity-level threat, and not enough time to explain properly. Can you come? Already packing, she replied with the kind of immediate trust that reminded me why I valued her so highly. How urgent are we talking? Drop everything and come now, I said grimly. Bring whatever you think might help against something that operates beyond normal power classifications. The second connection linked me to Rachel, whose sharp intelligence immediately picked up on the gravity in my voice. Arthur? Please tell me this isn't about another impossible situation that somehow fell into your lap. Worse, I admitted. I think we're about to face the emergence of the second calamity. I need your tactical analysis and fire magic. Are you available? For you? Always, she replied without hesitation. Coordinates. The remaining connections proceeded similarly, Serafina responding with calm professionalism, Reika offering gentle but absolute support, and Rose providing business-like efficiency that cut straight to the practical details of rapid deployment. As I finished the last call, I found the others watching me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to growing alarm. 5 of them, Jean asked with something approaching awe. Just how strong are your allies? Strong enough that I trust them with my life, I replied simply. And more importantly, strong enough that together we might be able to handle whatever emerges from that artifact's selection process. Rin stepped forward, her newly stabilized power creating subtle ripples in the ambient mana around her. What about us? Surely we can contribute something to whatever plan you're developing. I studied her for a moment, noting how her recent transformation had left her with capabilities that rivaled most legendary combatants despite her lack of practical experience. You'll stay here with your family and help coordinate the defense of the continent. If we fail to contain whatever emerges from the infernal Armis, the Western continent will need every advantage it can get. Through the command center's displays, we could see energy patterns around the distant crater beginning to shift and intensify. The selection process was accelerating, and soon we would know exactly what kind of threat had been unleashed upon the world. How long until your allies arrive? Mei Lin asked with the kind of tactical thinking that had made her an effective military commander. Hours, I replied, checking the various magical signatures that were already moving in our direction at tremendous speed. But I'm not sure we have that long. The artifact's trials might conclude at any moment. Callie's expression grew more determined as she processed the implications. Then we prepare for the worst and hope for the best. It's not like we have any other choice. As if summoned by her words, a new surge of energy erupted from the crater, visible even at this distance as a pillar of otherworldly light that pierced the sky like a beacon calling to every power-hungry individual on the continent. The trials have begun in earnest, I said quietly, feeling the artifact's influence spreading outward like ripples on a pond. Whatever happens next, the world is about to change forever. The birth of the second calamity was underway, and we could only watch and prepare for whatever emerged from that crucible of impossible power. Chapter 828. Infernal Armis. 3. The arrival of my 5 most trusted allies transformed the atmosphere within the Ashbluff Palace from desperate urgency to focused determination. Cecilia, Rachel, Serafina, Rose, and Reika had answered my call with the kind of immediate response that spoke to bonds forged through impossible trials and mutual trust that transcended normal friendship. Each of them represented high immortal rank power combined with combat experience that few individuals could match. Together, they constituted a force that could challenge small armies or legendary tier threats with reasonable hope of success. But even with their combined strength, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that what we were about to face would test us beyond anything we had previously encountered. A calamity will rise, Callie whispered from where she leaned against the command center's wall, her expression carrying the kind of dark understanding that came from recognizing historical patterns repeating themselves. The word hung in the air like a death sentence, its implications rippling through everyone present. Calamities weren't just powerful individuals or dangerous magical phenomena. They were forces of nature given human form, beings whose very existence rewrote the fundamental rules that governed reality. something regarded as myth in this world, or ancient history at best. That was all calamities were supposed to be, stories told to illustrate the consequences of unchecked power, cautionary tales about what happened when mortal ambition transcended mortal limitations. Until now, until another calamity would arise from the ruins of human frailty and divine artifact. I bit my lower lip in frustration as the familiar sense of inadequacy gnawed at my consciousness. Despite everything I had accomplished, despite the impossible battles I had won and the legendary opponents I had defeated, one crucial milestone remained beyond my reach. I still can't break through to Radiant rank, I thought with mounting anxiety, my enhanced senses detecting the immense energies still building around the distant crater. The gap between quasi-radiant and true radiant represented more than just increased power. It was a fundamental transformation that would unlock capabilities I desperately needed for what was coming. Arthur, relax. Rachel's voice whispered in my ear as her delicate hand settled on my arm, the familiar warmth of her touch providing comfort that went beyond simple physical contact. Her voice carried that ethereal quality that had always reminded me of silk swimming in moonlight, soft yet evocative in ways that sent pleasant shivers down my spine despite the gravity of our situation. I turned to meet the sapphire eyes of the blonde saintess, allowing a slight smile to touch my lips as I leaned forward to rest my forehead against hers. The simple gesture carried more reassurance than words ever could, her warmth serving as an anchor against the storm of worry that threatened to overwhelm my thoughts. No matter what emerges from that artifact, Seraphina said softly as she took my hand with delicate precision, her voice carrying the honey-sweet scent that always accompanied her presence. We will fight beside you. You don't have to face this alone. So don't do something absolutely reckless this time, Cecilia added with characteristic directness as she claimed my other hand, her crimson eyes flashing with affection mixed with exasperation. Her voice started with gentle scolding before softening into something more vulnerable. Please. I can't promise that, I replied with honest regret, feeling Luna's agreement ripple through our mental connection as she processed the same tactical concerns that plagued my thoughts. The worst-case scenario looming before us involved a direct confrontation between myself and whatever emerged from the Infernal Armis. Even assuming the new calamity would manifest at high Radiant rank, such a battle would push me far beyond my current capabilities. Regeneration became almost impossible when facing opponents of that caliber. I had been able to kill the Axe King efficiently by using Grey, but a calamity would possess similar reality-altering abilities that could circumvent even supernatural healing factors. Rachel's presence as a saintess would provide significant healing support for our entire group, but in a battle against forces that operated beyond normal limitations, even her legendary capabilities might prove insufficient to counteract the kind of devastating injuries such a confrontation could produce, which meant I would need to absorb the majority of the incoming damage myself, trusting in my enhanced constitution and Grey to survive what others could not. The energy readings from the crater are stabilizing, Rose observed from where she stood beside Reika near the command center's displays, her businesslike tone cutting through the emotional undercurrents with characteristic efficiency. Whatever transformation is occurring within the artifact's domain, it's approaching completion. Reika nodded with her usual gentle precision, her analytical mind processing the data streams with the kind of methodical thoroughness that had made her such an effective support specialist. The spatial distortions are beginning to contract inward. I estimate perhaps 30 minutes before the selection process concludes entirely. Then we need to finalize our approach, Valen said with the kind of decisive authority that had made him an effective ruler for over 2 decades. Arthur, what's your assessment of our tactical options? I studied the holographic displays showing the crater and its immediate surroundings, my enhanced perception noting details that conventional sensors couldn't capture. The Infernal Armis had created a domain of altered physics around itself, transforming the landscape into something that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Direct assault once the protective shell drops, I said after careful consideration. We can't allow whoever emerges from the trials to have time to adapt to their new capabilities. Mythical-grade artifacts grant immense power, but that power requires adjustment and practice to use effectively. Hit them before they understand what they've become, Cecilia summarized with tactical understanding that reflected years of combat experience. Exactly. The first few hours after bonding with an artifact of that magnitude are typically disorienting for the wielder. If we strike during that window, we might be able to end the threat before it fully manifests. Jean stepped forward from where he had been quietly observing our planning session. What about support forces? Surely coordinated military action could provide useful distraction even if direct engagement proves impossible. You and your father will coordinate that aspect, I replied, noting how his diplomatic training made him naturally consider broader strategic implications. But the core confrontation will need to be handled by individuals capable of operating at Calamity-adjacent power levels. The 6 of us, Serafina confirmed, her ice-blue eyes reflecting calm determination that had carried her through countless impossible situations. Mei Lin had been studying tactical projections with the kind of focused intensity that had made her an effective frontier commander. What about escape routes? If the initial assault fails and you need to withdraw for regrouping, then we improvise, I said grimly. Calamities don't typically allow for strategic withdrawals. Once engaged, such battles tend to conclude with total victory for one side or complete annihilation for the other. The holographic displays suddenly flared with renewed activity as energy readings from the crater spiked beyond anything previously recorded. Through the satellite feeds, we could see the pillar of otherworldly light that had been rising from the impact site beginning to pulse with rhythmic intensity that spoke to some kind of climactic transformation. It's happening? I said quietly, feeling the artifact's influence reaching across the distance to press against my enhanced senses like a physical weight. The trials are concluding. Valen's expression hardened with battle-tested resolve as he prepared to coordinate what might be the most important military operation in the Western continent's history. Then it's time to move. Arthur, are you ready? As ready as I can be, I replied, my hand moving to Nixthar's hilt, while my 3 companions took positions that spoke to years of coordinated combat experience. But even as we prepared to depart for what would likely prove to be the defining battle of our generation, something went catastrophically wrong. Crimson threads erupted from nowhere, moving with speed that transcended normal perception as they wrapped around Valen's body like living chains. The king of the Western continent had perhaps a split second to register the attack before finding himself completely immobilized by bonds that pulsed with malevolent energy. What? He began, but the threads tightened with enough force to cut off his words. My blood ran cold as recognition dawned. Those crimson threads carried a signature I had encountered before, one that belonged to an entity whose very name inspired terror across multiple continents. Alisara? I snarled, the word escaping through gritted teeth as fury and disbelief warred for dominance in my consciousness. Alisara Velcroix. The threads began pulling Valen away from our position with inexorable force, dragging him toward what would undoubtedly prove to be a confrontation designed to remove him from the equation entirely. His enhanced strength proved utterly insufficient against bonds that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. Go! Valen commanded through the supernatural restraints, his voice carrying absolute authority even as he disappeared into whatever trap Alisara had prepared. Don't let my situation compromise the mission. And just like that, our carefully planned assault had been reduced to chaos. The calamity was emerging from its trials with power that could reshape continents. Valen, our strongest ally and the military coordinator we had been counting on, had been removed from the board by one of the world's most dangerous individuals. The responsibility for preventing catastrophe had fallen entirely to myself and 5 women whose loyalty I trusted absolutely but whose combined strength might not prove sufficient for what we were about to face. I looked at Cecilia, Rachel, Serafina, Rose, Reika and the others, seeing my own grim determination reflected in their expressions. Change of plans, I said quietly, feeling the weight of impossible odds settling around us like a shroud. We're going in alone. The greatest battle of our lives was about to begin. Chapter 8:29. Infernal Armis. 4. The journey to the crater felt like traveling through a nightmare made manifest. As we approached the impact site, reality itself seemed to bend and warp around us, space-time distorting in ways that made my enhanced senses scream warnings about forces that operated beyond natural law. "Stay close," I called to Cecilia, Rachel, Serafina, Rose, and Reka as we flew toward the pillar of otherworldly light that marked the infernal Armis's location. The closer we get, the more unstable local physics become. Rachel's healing aura wrapped around our group like a protective cocoon, her Saintess abilities working to counteract the worst effects of the dimensional distortion. "I can feel it," she said through gritted teeth, her sapphire eyes reflecting strain as she fought to maintain our stability. Something immense just finished transforming. The crater came into view as we crested the final ridge, and I felt my breath catch at the scope of devastation that lay before us. What had once been rolling countryside now resembled a wound torn in the fabric of reality itself, with the infernal Armis resting at its center like a malevolent star that had fallen to earth. But it was the figure standing beside the artifact that made my blood run cold with recognition and growing dread. "Gideon?" I whispered, the name escaping my lips like a curse as I processed what I was seeing. Gideon Ironmaw stood at the heart of the crater, but he bore only passing resemblance to the young man I had defeated so effortlessly 4 years ago. The transformation that had claimed him went far beyond simple magical enhancement. This was fundamental alteration of his very nature, evolution into something that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine. His frame had expanded with supernatural muscle that spoke to strength beyond anything his father had ever achieved. Where Vorgoth Ironmaw had been impressive through sheer physical presence, Gideon now radiated power that made the very air around him shimmer with barely contained energy. His dark hair had taken on an almost metallic sheen, while his eyes burned with inner fire that seemed to pierce through the dimensional barriers surrounding the crater. But it was the equipment he now possessed that truly drove home the magnitude of what we were facing. The infernal Armis had bonded with him completely, manifesting as armor that seemed to be forged from crystallized destruction itself. The plates were black as the void between stars, but shot through with veins of molten energy that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Every surface carried engravings that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed, suggesting meanings that human consciousness wasn't equipped to comprehend. In his hands, he held a weapon that made his father's legendary axe look like a child's toy. The molten axe was easily twice the size of Vorgoth's weapon, its blade wreathed in flames that weren't quite fire and weren't quite shadow. The edge seemed to cut through space itself as he moved, leaving brief tears in reality that sealed themselves with reluctant slowness. "Arthur Nightingale," Gideon's voice carried across the crater with supernatural clarity, each word resonating with harmonics that spoke to power drawn from multiple sources. "For years ago, you humiliated me, made me understand how pathetically weak I truly was. I settled into a landing position at the crater's edge, my 5 companions flanking me while we assessed the unprecedented threat before us. Gideon, what have you done to yourself?" His laugh was a sound that belonged in nightmares, carrying undertones of madness mixed with absolute confidence. "I embraced what was necessary. When my father fell to your blade, I realized that conventional strength would never be sufficient to challenge you. So I accepted an offer that transformed me into something beyond your ability to comprehend. Through soul vision, I could see the true extent of his transformation. The infernal Armis had indeed bonded with him, granting access to power that operated on the mythical level. But there was something else woven through his energy signature, something that made Luna's consciousness recoil with alarm through our mental link. "Arthur," her warning carried genuine fear. "He's absorbed the body aspect of the heavenly demon. That's not just artifact enhancement. He's been fundamentally remade according to demonic design principles." The implications crashed over me like a physical blow. The heavenly demon was one of the few beings in existence whose power truly reached the level of a demigod. If Gideon had somehow absorbed even a fragment of that power. "You feel it, don't you?" Gideon said with savage satisfaction as he noted my expression. "The magnitude of what I've become. I'm no longer the weak heir who cowered in his father's shadow. I am the second calamity, and I will reshape this world according to my vision." "The body aspect," I said quietly, my analytical mind working through what such transformation would mean for his capabilities. That's how you're channeling power of this magnitude without being torn apart by the forces involved. Clever as always, he acknowledged with mock appreciation. The heavenly demon's gift has remade my physical form to serve as a proper vessel for mythical-grade power. Every cell in my body now operates according to principles that transcend human limitation. Cecilia stepped forward slightly, her crimson eyes narrowing as she assessed the threat before us. Arthur. His power signature is unlike anything I've encountered before. The readings don't make sense according to conventional classification systems. Because he's operating beyond those systems entirely, I replied grimly, my hand moving to Nixthar's hilt while every instinct I possessed screamed warnings about the danger we faced. Gideon has become exactly what calamities are meant to be, forces of nature given human form. Rachel's expression grew determined as she felt the overwhelming malevolence radiating from Gideon's transformed state. If we're facing a calamity, then we need every advantage we can get. She raised her hands toward the sky, her pure light blazing brighter as she called upon power that few saintesses ever accessed. Aurelius! Her voice carried across the crater with divine authority. I have need of you. The response was immediate and awe-inspiring. A pillar of golden flame erupted from nowhere, ascending toward the heavens before spiraling downward to materialize beside Rachel. From the divine fire emerged a magnificent phoenix, his form radiating power that made the very air shimmer with sacred energy. Aurelius stood nearly 8 feet tall, his wingspan easily twice that when fully extended. His feathers were living flame that shifted between gold and crimson, each one carrying enough divine energy to purify corruption wherever it touched. His eyes burned with ancient wisdom and barely contained fury as he assessed the threat before them. My saintess calls and I answer, Aurelius said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to make the crater itself ring like a struck bell. This abomination dares challenge divine authority? The phoenix's presence immediately began countering Gideon's corrupting influence. Where the calamity's miasma had started to spread, Aurelius's divine flames pushed it back, creating zones of purified space that allowed us to operate normally despite the reality-warping effects. Gideon's burning eyes narrowed as he studied the newcomer. A divine beast, he observed with grudging respect. Impressive. Your Phoenix Lord will make the coming battle more interesting. And now, Gideon continued, raising his molten axe while the infernal Armis responded to his will with eager anticipation. I will demonstrate the futility of your resistance. My father was weak, bound by conventional thinking and limited ambition. I have transcended such pathetic constraints. The air around him began to darken as power beyond description started flowing through his transformed frame. Not just mana, but something far more fundamental, the kind of energy that could rewrite the basic laws governing reality itself. The molten axe blazed brighter as it channeled forces that shouldn't have been possible for any mortal being to wield. You killed my father, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction that spoke to obsession refined through years of planning. Humiliated my organization, destroyed everything I was raised to believe in. For that, you will suffer before you die. Aurelius spread his wings wide, divine flames cascading from his feathers like liquid starlight. Your corruption will not stand against the light of divine justice, the Phoenix declared, his voice carrying the weight of ancient oaths and sacred duty. Rachel's healing aura intensified around our group as she prepared for combat against an opponent whose capabilities defied easy assessment. Arthur, whatever we're going to do, we need to decide quickly. The energy he's building is approaching critical levels. Seraphina's ice-blue eyes reflected calm determination despite the magnitude of the threat before us. His transformation may be impressive, but he's still fundamentally the same person we've faced before. Arrogance and anger can be exploited, regardless of power level. Rose stepped forward, her businesslike demeanor not quite masking the concern in her eyes. The energy readings are beyond anything our previous encounters have prepared us for. We'll need perfect coordination. Reika nodded with gentle precision, her analytical mind already working through tactical possibilities. But we've faced impossible odds before. Together, we can find a way through this. I nodded, appreciating their confidence even as my own consciousness grappled with tactical realities that offered no easy solutions. Gideon had indeed become something approaching a demigod, with access to power that could challenge the strongest beings in existence. But he was also newly transformed, still adapting to capabilities that had been granted rather than earned through experience. Find this Sachapointye ars Surca. Together, I said quietly, feeling Nixthar respond to my determination with eager anticipation. We end this before he can fully understand what he's become. Aurelius's flames blazed brighter as the phoenix prepared for battle. I stand with the saintess and her chosen companions. Let this pretender learn what it means to face divine wrath. But even as we spoke, the space around Gideon began to fill with energies that made the very concept of distance meaningless. Black mana poured from his transformed frame in waves that carried the corruption of the heavenly demon, while the infernal Armis added its own reality-warping influence to create a domain where normal physical laws simply ceased to apply. Miasma spread outward from his position like a living thing, transforming the crater into something that existed partially outside the natural world. The air itself became thick with malevolent energy that sought to drain life from anything foolish enough to oppose the second calamity's will. "Welcome to my domain," Gideon said with satisfaction that bordered on ecstasy as his power reached full manifestation. "Here I am absolute. Here your strength means nothing. Here you will learn what it means to face a true calamity." The space around us continued to darken as reality itself bent to accommodate forces that had never been meant to exist in the mortal realm. But Aurelius's divine presence created islands of stability within the chaos, his flames pushing back against the corruption with power drawn from the same source that had created the world itself. The final battle was about to begin, and I could only hope that our combined strength, enhanced by divine assistance, would prove sufficient against an opponent who had transcended every limitation I had previously encountered. The second calamity had awakened, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 830. When Darkness Falls. Grand Marshal Maylin Potton stood frozen in the command center of Fort Meridian, her golden eyes locked on the array of digital displays and holographic projections that showed real-time satellite feeds from the crater. The woman who had coordinated defensive operations against continental threats, using the most advanced magical technology available, now found herself confronting something that rendered all her experience meaningless. The corruption was spreading. What had begun as localized distortion around the distant crater was now expanding outward in a radius of devastation that defied every defensive protocol in their databases. The satellite feeds showed the landscape itself beginning to warp and twist as waves of corrupted mana, an unholy amalgamation of miasma and pure destructive force, rolled across the terrain like a tsunami of conceptual ruin. "Marshal," came a trembling voice from behind her. Captain Hadrian approached the command console, his fingers flying across holographic interfaces as he tried to process readings that made no sense according to any known classification system. "The energy signature is expanding at approximately 50 kilometers per hour. At this rate, it will reach populated areas within 12 hours. Maylin turned toward the main tactical display, watching as computer models struggled to predict the path of something that operated beyond the laws of physics their systems were designed to understand. "What about the corruption itself? Any analysis on its composition?" "That's just it, ma'am," Hadrian replied, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose scientific worldview was being systematically dismantled. "It's not just energy or magical distortion. Our sensors are detecting conceptual alterations to reality itself. The very idea of destruction is being given physical form and spreading outward from the epicenter." Through the reinforced windows of the command center, Maylin could see her soldiers gathered around their own tactical displays, their faces illuminated by the glow of emergency alerts and threat assessment protocols. These were men and women trained to operate the most advanced magical technological hybrid weapons on the continent, who had undergone enhancement procedures that pushed human capability to its limits. Thefel Serious Leveson My Virtual. Library Empire. MVL0EMPYR. And yet, As they watched the spreading zone of corruption advance toward their position, their enhanced perception made them more acutely aware of how utterly outclassed they were. "Marshal," came a trembling voice from behind her. Captain Hadrian, a veteran of countless border skirmishes whose courage had never been questioned, approached with hands that shook despite his best efforts to maintain composure. The readings, ma'am. They're beyond anything our instruments can measure." Maylin turned toward him, noting how his weathered face had gone pale beneath his battle scars. "Report, Captain. The energy signature is expanding at an exponential rate," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Conservative estimates suggest the affected area will encompass the entire western continent within hours." "But ma'am," he paused, swallowing hard. "The power levels we're detecting, they're not human. They're not even natural. This is something else entirely." Through the reinforced windows of the command structure, Maylin could see her soldiers, men and women who had volunteered to stand guard at the edge of civilization, who had faced down horrors that would break lesser individuals, now huddled together like children seeking comfort in a thunderstorm. Their weapons hung forgotten at their sides, their training rendered irrelevant by the simple understanding that what approached them was beyond the scope of military response. Lieutenant Torres, barely 25 and enhanced with the latest generation of combat augmentations, was staring at her tactical display with tears streaming down her face as she watched the corruption readings climb beyond anything their threat assessment algorithms could process. Sergeant Morrison, a veteran whose cybernetic enhancements had never failed him in 2 decades of service, sat slumped against a wall with his head in his hands, the steady pulse of his technological implants providing a rhythmic counterpoint to his whispered prayers. "How do you fight the birth of a demigod?" whispered Corporal Blake, his voice carrying the kind of existential dread that came from recognizing their utter insignificance in the face of ascending divinity. "How do you oppose someone who's transcending the very concept of mortality?" Maylin had no answer. Her enhanced tactical implants were feeding her streams of data about energy signatures that defied classification, about reality distortions that suggested someone was rewriting the fundamental laws of physics through sheer force of will. This wasn't an enemy that could be outmaneuvered through superior technology or overwhelmed through coordinated firepower. This was the birth of something that operated beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The corruption continued its advance, and with it came a presence that pressed against their consciousness like a physical weight. Several of her younger soldiers, despite their mental conditioning and psychological enhancements, had already begun to show signs of strain as their augmented perception made them more vulnerable to the overwhelming aura of the emerging demigod. Hundreds of kilometers away from the fortress, in the sprawling metropolitan areas and suburban districts of the western continent, civilian populations experienced their own form of dawning horror as emergency broadcast systems activated across every communication network. The corruption was visible even at vast distances through satellite feeds and aerial reconnaissance, a spreading zone of reality distortion that grew larger with each passing hour. In the capital city of Valdris, people gathered in public squares and around massive holographic displays to watch the live feeds with a mixture of awe and terror. Children pressed against their parents while elderly citizens who had lived through technological revolutions and magical breakthroughs found themselves confronting something that transcended every category of crisis they had previously imagined. "What is it?" asked a merchant, his voice amplified by the crowd's communication implants as desperate hope still clung to rational explanations. "Some kind of experimental weapon malfunction? A dimensional breach?" But even as the words spread through the networked crowd, everyone present could feel the wrongness that accompanied the spreading corruption through their enhanced senses and technological augmentations. This wasn't a failure of science or magic. This was the birth of something that operated beyond the boundaries of both, a being ascending to divinity while reality itself bent to accommodate forces that had never been meant to exist in the mortal realm. Panic began to ripple through the population as emergency alerts flooded their personal devices and neural implants. Enhanced individuals throughout the major cities confirmed what sensitive systems already knew. They were witnessing the emergence of something that defied every threat classification in their databases. Parents activated safety protocols for their children while businesses initiated emergency shutdowns, survival algorithms finally overriding the comfortable routines of modern civilization. Deep within the crystalline spires of the Ebony Tower, its surface embedded with the most advanced magical technological hybrid systems on the continent, the most powerful dark mages and necromancers available experienced their own form of existential crisis. And yet, confronted with readings that showed someone ascending to true divinity in real time, they found themselves as helpless as the most common citizen. Tower Master Paul Locrian stood in his private chambers at the apex of the great structure, his hands pressed against smart glass windows that automatically adjusted their opacity to filter the overwhelming energies emanating from the distant crater. The man who had risen to leadership of the most exclusive organization on the continent through a combination of exceptional talent and Arthur Nightingale's unexpected assistance now found himself watching readouts that defied every theoretical framework he had spent decades mastering. "Master," came a hesitant voice from behind him, transmitted through the room's communication system. Archmagus Helena Voss, one of his most trusted advisors and a practitioner whose enhanced abilities rivaled those of continental rulers, appeared as a holographic projection with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal terror. "The council has convened as you requested. But what?" Paul asked without turning from the window, his voice carrying a hollow quality that reflected the void growing in his chest as he contemplated what they were facing. "They're paralyzed, Master. Every one of them." Paul nodded with grim understanding. The circle of the Ebony Tower represented the pinnacle of deep dark achievement on the continent. 9 individuals whose combined power could level cities and reshape landscapes according to their will. If they were reduced to quivering terror by what approached, what hope did anyone else have? "And the junior mages?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Most have already fled," Helena admitted with the kind of professional shame that came from watching one's organization crumble in real time. "Those who remain are either too terrified to move or too proud to admit defeat. But Master, perhaps they're right to run. What we're facing, it's not something that can be opposed through conventional means." Paul finally turned from the window, his pale features reflecting the kind of resignation that came from recognizing an absolute truth. "You're suggesting we abandon everything we've built? Allow our life's work to be swept aside by some upstart who stumbled into power beyond his comprehension?" "I'm suggesting we survive," Helena replied with desperate intensity. "Because the alternative is annihilation for everyone foolish enough to stand in its path." Around them, the tower's vast research complexes and automated laboratories continued their work with the kind of mechanical precision that spoke to centuries of accumulated knowledge integrated with cutting-edge technology. Quantum-enhanced computers processed data streams about the expanding corruption while AI-assisted analysis systems attempted to categorize energy readings that violated every known theoretical framework. But the scholars and researchers who should have been interpreting this unprecedented phenomenon sat in stunned silence before their displays, their enhanced minds overwhelmed by the simple reality that they were witnessing something beyond the scope of scientific study. This was no longer about understanding or categorizing the threat through conventional analysis. This was about acknowledging that some forces existed beyond human ability to comprehend or control, regardless of how advanced their technology or refined their magical techniques had become, and that wisdom sometimes lay in recognizing when resistance became indistinguishable from suicide. Throughout the affected regions, from the most remote monitoring stations to the most prestigious research facilities, the same realization was dawning with horrifying clarity. They were witnessing the birth of a true demigod, a being whose ascension was rewriting the fundamental laws of reality in an expanding sphere of influence that threatened to engulf everything in its path. The corruption continued to spread, carrying with it the promise of transformation that few would survive and fewer still would welcome. Hope itself seemed to be fleeing ahead of the advancing zone of conceptual ruin, leaving behind only the cold certainty that they were facing forces beyond human ability to comprehend or control. But then, just as despair threatened to claim the last vestiges of resistance, something changed. A pillar of pure radiance erupted from the heart of the corruption, not the harsh glare of destructive magic, but something that spoke to powers drawn from entirely different sources. It cut through the spreading miasma like a blade of crystallized starlight, carving a path of clarity through the chaos that had seemed absolute, standing in perfect opposition to the concepts of ruin and destruction that had been poisoning reality itself. For the first time since the catastrophe began, those who witnessed it through their screens and sensors felt something they had thought lost forever. Hope. Chapter 831, True Obsession. His gaze turned upward, and King Valen Ashbluff felt his blood freeze in his veins. Alisara Velcroix smiled from the heavens above, her presence warping reality around her like heat distortion rising from sun-baked stone. Her jade-green eyes held depths that seemed to swallow light itself, while her pink hair cascaded around her shoulders like liquid silk touched by starlight. And then, without a sound, without a gesture, the world twisted around him. In an instant, Valen found himself somewhere else entirely, not just displaced, but transported to a realm that existed according to rules that defied every law of physics he had spent decades mastering. The air here was thick and silent, heavy with a presence that pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. A new space, vast yet intimate, wrapped him in threads of eerie stillness that spoke to power operating beyond mortal comprehension. It was Alisara's world. She stood before him, her crimson threads woven through the air like veins of molten fire, glistening with energies that made his enhanced senses recoil instinctively. Each strand pulsed with life of its own, creating patterns in the dimensional fabric that hurt to observe directly. Her jade-green eyes studied him with the kind of dangerous curiosity that a predator might show toward particularly interesting prey. "Valen Ashbluff," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the strange space with crystalline clarity. "The king of the Western continent." How quaint. Valen's instincts, honed through 2 decades of surviving in a world where political miscalculation meant death, immediately recognized the magnitude of threat he faced. His mana surged as he activated every defensive enhancement at his disposal, shadow armor materializing around his form, while his legendary daggers appeared in his hands with practiced efficiency. "What do you want, Alisara?" he demanded, settling into a combat stance that had served him well against continental-level threats. Her laugh was like silver bells touched by winter frost. "What I want? Oh, dear Valen, you misunderstand the nature of our relationship entirely." Before he could react, crimson threads erupted from every surface of the dimensional space, moving with speed that transcended normal perception. They wrapped around his shadow armor like living chains, their touch sending spikes of agony through his enhanced nervous system as they began to drain his mana reserves at an alarming rate. Valen's eyes widened in shock as he felt his legendary-grade defenses crumbling under forces that operated according to principles he didn't recognize. The armor that had protected him from attacks that could level mountains was being dissolved like morning mist, while the daggers that had carved through the strongest enchantments felt suddenly heavy and ineffective in his hands. "Impossible," he gasped, his analytical mind struggling to process readings that defied every classification system he had ever studied. "You're not even using a domain. How are you?" "Because this isn't a domain, little king," Alisara interrupted with condescending amusement. "This is reality itself, reshaped according to my will. The space you're standing in exists because I allow it to exist. The air you're breathing continues to support life because I find your presence temporarily useful." The implications of her words crashed over Valen like a physical blow. He had achieved mid-radiant rank through decades of relentless training and enhancement, becoming the strongest ruler in the world through sheer force of will and accumulated power. But standing before Alisara, he felt like a child playing with wooden swords while facing a master warrior. "You're beyond classification," he whispered, genuine awe bleeding through his controlled demeanor. "Beyond anything the current world has produced." "Finally," she said with satisfaction that spoke to someone who rarely encountered individuals capable of recognizing true power. "A ruler who possesses the wisdom to acknowledge when he's outclassed. How refreshing." But even as she spoke, the space around them shifted again, reality bending to accommodate another presence being forcibly transported to her domain. Gideon Ironmaw materialized in the center of the dimensional construct, his form wreathed in the terrible majesty of the infernal Armus, while the body aspect of the heavenly demon radiated from his transformed frame. The newly ascended Calamity took in his surroundings with burning eyes, his molten axe materializing in his hands as he processed the threat represented by Alisara's presence. Unlike Valen, whose experience had taught him caution, Gideon possessed the arrogance of someone who had just transcended every limitation he had previously known. "Another pest to deal with," he snarled, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to power drawn from multiple sources. "You dare to interfere with my ascension?" Alisara's expression shifted from mild amusement to genuine interest as she studied the artifact-enhanced young man before her. "Oh, how delightful! The infernal Armis has finally found a worthy vessel. And you've managed to integrate the heavenly demon's body aspect as well. Quite impressive, child." Gideon's power surged in response to what he perceived as condescension. Miasma and mana infused with the relentless essence of carnage, roaring out of him like a hurricane given physical form. The infernal Armis amplified his presence exponentially, the energy expanding outward in waves that sought to dominate the space around him through sheer overwhelming force. For a moment, it seemed like the molten crown of his ascension might engulf even her realm, the concepts of ruin and destruction spreading through the dimensional fabric like a virus rewriting the fundamental laws of existence. Then, everything stopped. Crimson threads shot out from every corner of the space with surgical precision, piercing his aura like needles through fabric. They wrapped around his expanding energy, strangling it, unraveling his intent with the casual efficiency of someone dismantling a child's toy. The force of his axe unity roared in defiance, the infernal Armis burning brighter as it channeled power that should have been irresistible, but it wasn't enough. The threads coiled tighter, slicing through his calamity-level abilities, deflecting them like an errant breeze. "Incredible," Alisara said, her voice soft but resonating with genuine appreciation. Her smile widened as she tilted her head, studying him like one might examine a fascinating specimen. "With the infernal Armis, you've taken great strides, young Gideon. You've managed to brush against the power of a true demigod." Her tone was one of praise, but there was no mistaking the condescension that laced her words. To her, his ascension was impressive in the way a particularly talented student's first breakthrough might be impressive, admirable but insignificant in the face of her own mastery. Gideon met her gaze, his molten eyes narrowing as he processed the reality of what he faced. "Yet you stand above it," he admitted, his voice even despite the rage that burned in his chest. His grip tightened on the ruin axe, the weapon's edge cutting small tears in the dimensional fabric around him. Her smile softened slightly, almost pitying. "You've grown, but evolution has its limits. It's still bound by the capacity of the one evolving," she replied with the kind of gentle cruelty that only true superiority could produce. "Power without understanding is just sophisticated destruction." Valen, still trapped within the crimson threads but able to observe the interaction, felt his strategic mind working through implications that chilled him to the bone. If Alisara could casually dominate both himself and a newly ascended Calamity simultaneously, what did that say about the true scope of her capabilities? "Why?" he asked, drawing both their attention. "Why reveal yourself now? Why interfere with events that don't directly threaten your interests?" Alisara's jade eyes glimmered with something that might have been longing, her expression growing distant but sharp. "Because," she said softly, her voice carrying undertones that spoke to emotions too complex for simple categorization, "he's down there, fighting a battle that will push him to his absolute limits. And I cannot allow anything to interfere with that beautiful struggle." "He," Gideon demanded, though something in his enhanced perception was beginning to piece together the truth. "Arthur Nightingale," Alisara breathed, the name leaving her lips like a prayer. Her expression grew almost rapturous as she continued, the crimson threads around them pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Do you understand what he represents? He's not just powerful. Power is common enough among the truly exceptional. No, he's something far more precious. He's unpredictable. He's genuine. He's the first person I've encountered who is worthy." My virtual library empire, MVLE1MPYR, thanks you for reading at the source. The obsession in her voice was unmistakable. carrying the weight of someone who had spent lifetimes searching for something that could capture and hold her interest. Valen felt his blood run cold as he recognized the signs of fixation that transcended normal human emotion. "You're in love with him," he said with dawning horror. She gestured casually, and both Valen and Gideon found themselves completely immobilized by threads that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Which is why, Valen, you will be allowed to interfere with his current battle," she continued with the kind of absolute certainty that brooked no argument. "He needs to face this challenge alone, with only his chosen companions. He needs to be pushed to his limits, to discover what lies beyond his current understanding of power. I'm providing him with the exact amount of challenge he needs to grow," Alisara corrected with clinical precision. "Too little opposition and he becomes complacent. Too much and he might actually die, which would be disappointing." Her jade eyes glowed with anticipation that bordered on hunger. But this level of threat, facing a calamity while his strongest ally is occupied elsewhere, this will force him to reach deeper into his potential than he ever has before. This will show me what he truly becomes when everything depends on his choices. The space around them began to shift again, reality bending to accommodate Alisara's will as she prepared to return them to their respective battles. But her voice followed them even as the dimensional construct began to dissolve. "Don't disappoint me, Arthur," she whispered, her words carrying across impossible distances to reach ears that would never hear them. "Show me what lies beyond the impossible. Show me why you're worth this investment." Chapter 832. Confronting a Calamity. I exhaled, feeling pure light from Rachel wash over me like liquid starlight made manifest. The radiant energy flowed through my system with perfect precision, not just enhancing my capabilities, but actively pushing back against the oppressive miasma that Gideon's transformation had spread across the battlefield. Where his corruption sought to drain life and twist reality according to concepts of ruin and destruction, Rachel's light restored balance and clarity to both mind and body. "Much better," I said, rolling my shoulders as the enhancements settled into my bones. Sword unity flowed through my connection with Nixthar like water finding its proper channel, while gray began to circulate through my system in carefully controlled amounts. Even with Rachel's support stabilizing my body, I could feel the strain of channeling forces that I hadn't quite mastered yet, but it was manageable, sustainable for an extended confrontation. Gideon stood at the heart of his expanding domain of corruption, the infernal Armus pulsing with rhythm that matched his heartbeat, while the molten axe in his hands seemed to cut through space itself with each casual movement. His transformed features carried the kind of terrible beauty that spoke to power drawn from multiple divine sources, while his eyes burned with inner fire that promised devastation beyond mortal comprehension. "Impressive," he acknowledged, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air tremble. "But light has always been temporary. Darkness is eternal." Before any of us could respond to his philosophical observation, the space around us exploded into motion as new threats materialized from the dimensional distortions surrounding the crater. Black roses erupted from nowhere, each petal edged with corruption that sought to drain life from anything it touched. They moved with predatory intelligence, weaving between our defensive positions while their thorns promised death to anyone foolish enough to make contact. But before the deadly flowers could reach their intended targets, they met an unexpected obstacle. Blue roses materialized in their path like guardians made of crystallized impossibility, their petals shimmering with energies that defied easy categorization. Where the black roses carried corruption and death, the blue ones radiated something far more complex. The power of paradox itself, reality bending around them in ways that made conventional physics weep in surrender. The two forces met in midair with a sound like reality tearing, black petals disintegrating as they encountered their azure counterparts. But rather than simply destroying the attack, the blue roses seemed to reverse its very nature, transforming corruption into purification and malevolence into protective energy that spread outward in rippling waves. "Hello, Mother," Rose said with deadly calm, stepping forward as more blue roses bloomed around her like a garden of impossible beauty. "I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Tia xtias query dfrm. From the dimensional distortions emerged a woman whose presence carried the weight of accumulated atrocity refined through decades of calculated evil. Evelyn Alaric, cult leader of the Order of Fallen Flame, moved with the kind of predatory grace that spoke to someone who had embraced corruption so completely that she had become something beyond simple human classification. Her black roses continued to manifest around her in patterns that hurt to observe directly, each bloom carrying 9-circle magical construction that transformed simple floral imagery into weapons capable of threatening continental-level combatants. But it was her eyes that truly captured attention, empty of everything except the cold satisfaction of someone who had found perfect purpose in the destruction of others. "My dear Rose," Evelyn replied with mockery that carried notes of genuine maternal affection twisted into something obscene. "Look how strong you've become. I'm so proud of what my training helped you achieve." "Your training taught me exactly what I never wanted to become," Rose shot back, her blue roses spreading outward in defensive formations, while her businesslike demeanor remained perfectly intact despite the emotional weight of the confrontation. "Which makes this conversation unnecessary." "I'll handle her," Serafina said with the kind of calm determination that had carried her through countless impossible situations. Her ice-blue eyes reflected understanding of what this confrontation meant to Rose personally. "Go," I confirmed with a slight nod, recognizing that splitting our forces was tactically risky but emotionally necessary. Rose needed to face her past, and Serafina was strong enough to provide the support she would require. "We can manage here." The two women moved toward Evelyn with coordinated precision, blue roses and ice magic combining to create a barrier that separated their battle from ours. As they engaged, the sound of their conflict became a distant counterpoint to the more immediate threat standing before us, which left Cecilia, Rachel, Reka, and myself to face the second calamity. "For against one," Gideon observed with amusement that carried undertones of genuine anticipation. "How sporting of you, though I wonder if you truly understand the magnitude of what you're attempting." "We're about to find out," Cecilia replied with characteristic directness, crimson energy beginning to coalesce around her hands as her witchcraft gift responded to her will. The chaos magic that manifested carried notes of barely controlled destruction, reality bending around her spells in ways that spoke to forces drawn from the spaces between order and entropy. Reka moved to flank our formation, her sword appearing in her hands while intricate script began to flow across her skin like living tattoos. The cursed script gift manifested as wings of pure energy that sprouted from her shoulders, while additional characters wrote themselves along her arms to enhance her physical capabilities beyond normal human limitations. "Together," I said quietly, feeling Nixthar hum with anticipation while gray flowed through my system in carefully measured amounts. "But don't overcommit early. This is going to be a long fight." Gideon's response was a smile that belonged in nightmares, his molten axe beginning to glow brighter as he prepared to demonstrate exactly why the Infernal Armis was considered one of the 7 most dangerous artifacts in existence. The battle began not with dramatic flourishes or overwhelming displays of force, but with the kind of careful probing that marked the opening movements of a conflict between beings who understood that hasty action led to swift defeat. Gideon's first attack was almost casual, a horizontal sweep of his massive axe that sent waves of corrupted energy rolling across the battlefield like tsunamis of pure destruction. The strike carried enough force to level mountains, but it was clearly just a test to gauge our defensive capabilities. I met the wave with Nixthar's edge while gray flowed through the legendary blade, the impossible energy cutting through concepts of ruin and destruction as easily as it might part water. Beside me, Cecilia's crimson magic manifested as chaotic barriers that didn't just absorb the attack but transformed it into something else entirely, turning destruction into creation, malevolence into beneficial energy that actually strengthened our position. Rachel's pure light intensified around all of us, her healing aura working to counteract the corrupting effects of Gideon's presence, while simultaneously enhancing our own capabilities through divine energy that operated according to principles of restoration and renewal. The combination of her support with my gray created a zone of stability that allowed us to operate normally despite the reality-warping effects of the calamity's domain. Reka took advantage of the opening created by our defensive success, her enhanced wings carrying her forward with speed that transcended normal limitations, while her blade traced patterns in the air that left brief tears in spacetime. The cursed script covering her body glowed brighter as she channeled more power into her physical enhancements, transforming her from merely skilled swordswoman into something approaching a force of nature. But Gideon was ready for her approach. His free hand gestured casually, and the space around Reika filled with constructs of pure malevolence. Not physical obstacles, but conceptual barriers that sought to prevent the very idea of successful attack from manifesting in his vicinity. Reika's response was to activate additional script across her skin, the cursed characters rewriting the fundamental laws governing her interaction with reality. Where Gideon's defenses tried to prevent attack, her gift asserted that attack was not only possible but inevitable. The paradox created sparks of discharged energy that lit up the battlefield like miniature stars being born and dying in rapid succession. "Interesting," Gideon murmured, his burning eyes tracking our movements with the kind of analytical attention that spoke to someone genuinely engaged by the challenge we represented. "You're not just relying on brute force. How refreshing." His axe moved in a complex pattern that seemed to cut through multiple dimensions simultaneously, each swing leaving trails of destruction that hung in the air like wounds in reality itself. The infernal Armis responded to his will by manifesting those cuts as persistent hazards, creating a maze of dangerous space that we would need to navigate while mounting our own attacks. But rather than being intimidated by the display, I felt a familiar surge of excitement that came from facing an opponent who could genuinely challenge everything I had learned. This was what I had been training for, not just the power to overwhelm lesser threats, but the skill and determination necessary to face someone who operated on a similar level of capability. "Your turn," I said to my companions, raising Nixthar while gray flowed through the blade in patterns that made the very air around us shimmer with potential energy. Chapter 833, Cracks in Calamity. Gideon Ironmaw studied Arthur Nightingale with the kind of analytical precision that had served him well through countless battles, his burning eyes taking in every detail of his opponent's stance and energy flow. The young man before him possessed a ridiculous level of strength for someone this young. Not only had he killed the Axe King with apparent ease, but now he was able to challenge him. That gray energy flowing around Arthur's blade was particularly fascinating. It had effortlessly erased his miasma and the concept-infused mana from the infernal Armis, cutting through forces that should have been absolute according to the artifact's accumulated knowledge. When Gideon attempted to analyze the energy more deeply, pain spiked through his skull like his brain was being torn apart at the molecular level. Incomprehensible, he realized with genuine surprise, even drawing upon the vast repository of knowledge that the infernal Armis had accumulated over millennia. That power existed beyond his ability to understand, operating according to principles that transcended conventional magical theory. The artifact itself seemed to recoil from the gray, as though even its divine-level consciousness found the energy fundamentally wrong. But understanding wasn't necessary for victory. His enhanced senses easily detected the thread of pure light connecting Arthur to Rachel, who maintained a constant flow of healing energy that kept him functional despite the strain of channeling forces his body wasn't meant to contain. The Saintess of the North, one of the most powerful pure light users in the world at merely 23 years old. Without her continuous support, Arthur would have already succumbed to the reality-warping effects of his own technique. "I can feel more knowledge flowing through me now," Gideon thought as the molten axe in his hands pulsed with increased intensity. Raw power meant nothing without the understanding of how to properly apply it, and he had been somewhat disadvantaged by gaining access to the infernal Armis so recently. But that limitation was rapidly disappearing as the artifact's accumulated combat experience integrated with his own capabilities. After all, he was the second calamity. "Your gray power is impressive," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity. "But it's killing you from within. I can see the way your body trembles with each use, the blood seeping from your eyes. How long can you maintain something so fundamentally destructive?" Arthur's response was to channel more gray through Nixthar, the impossible fusion of deep dark and pure light making the blade's edge shimmer with colors that hurt to perceive directly. "Long enough," he replied through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the obvious agony coursing through his system. Gideon raised his axe with deliberate slowness, allowing his opponents to see the attack coming while his eyes blazed with anticipation. The infernal Armis responded to his will by manifesting additional weight drawn from collapsed dimensions, its molten edge beginning to glow with intensity that made the air itself burn. Then, without warning, he collapsed the space between them. The world became a blur of motion as Arthur struck with speed that transcended normal limitations, his approach crushing the space-time axis so dramatically that even Gideon's enhanced perceptions could barely track the movement. Gray flowed through Nixthar like liquid starlight made of impossible colors, the energy finding gaps in Gideon's defenses that shouldn't have existed. But it didn't matter. Even as Arthur's devastating attack connected, carving a shallow line across his enhanced flesh that made his very nature recoil in horror, Gideon's axe continued its downward trajectory toward his opponent's position. The infernal Armis carved through air, its molten edge promising devastation that would end the fight before it truly began. Arthur's response was immediate and impressive. Nixthar materialized in a defensive position wreathed in layers of carefully controlled astral energy, with spots of deep dark adding an ominous counterpoint to the blade's ethereal glow. The legendary sword moved to intercept the axe's path with precision that spoke to perfect unity between wielder and weapon. He's actually going to meet my strike directly? Gideon thought with genuine amusement. But before the weapons could meet, Reika appeared between them like a wraith given form. Her cursed script-enhanced speed allowed her to intercept the axe's descent, her own blade blazing with characters that rewrote the fundamental laws governing the interaction. Wings of supernatural energy spread from her shoulders, while additional script wrote itself along her arms, enhancing her strength beyond normal human limitations. The impact sent shockwaves through the battlefield, her enhanced capabilities allowing her to momentarily halt a strike that could have leveled mountains. The cursed characters covering her body blazed white-hot as they asserted that her strength was greater than physics suggested, that her blade could withstand forces that should have shattered it instantly. Of course, that alone wouldn't have been sufficient. What truly made the defense effective was Cecilia's chaotic magic manifesting as countless alterations to the space around them. Reality twisted and folded according to her will, her witchcraft gift creating dimensional pockets that absorbed and redirected the overflow of destructive energy, while simultaneously providing additional leverage for Reika's desperate block. Crimson spells rewrote the laws of cause and effect, making Gideon's overwhelming force somehow less overwhelming. Impressive coordination, Gideon acknowledged with genuine respect, even as he applied more pressure to his axe. The infernal Armis responded by manifesting additional weight drawn from collapsed dimensions, its molten edge beginning to cut through Reika's defenses despite her enhanced capabilities. But coordination has its limits. The artifact's power surged, and Reika's script-enhanced strength began to falter under the increasing pressure. Her blade, despite its cursed enhancements, started to show hairline cracks as forces beyond its design parameters pressed against its structure. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she poured more power into her defensive stance, additional characters blazing across her skin in desperate attempts to maintain the block. But Arthur wasn't finished. While his teammate held the axe at bay, Arthur flowed around the engagement like liquid shadow, astral energy cascading through Nixthar in patterns that made the very air shimmer with potential energy. His sword technique manifested as the second movement of his Grade 6 art, Hollow Eclipse. The strike carried more pure destructive output than his previous attacks, the blade cutting through conceptual barriers as easily as it might part water. But this wasn't the simple negation he had demonstrated before. This was targeted annihilation, focused on the connection between Gideon and the space around him. Gideon's response was to release Reika from the bind by shifting his axe's angle at the last possible moment, allowing her to stumble away while he turned to face Arthur's devastating assault. The weapons met with a sound like reality screaming, forces that existed beyond normal classification grinding against each other in a display that painted the battlefield in impossible colors. The gray flowing through Nixthar carved into the molten edge of the infernal Armis, and for a moment, the artifact's power actually faltered. Where the impossible energy made contact, the corruption that defined Gideon's enhancement began to retreat, as though his very nature was being negated at the fundamental level. "What are you?" Gideon demanded, his voice carrying notes of genuine fear as he felt something fundamental about his transformed state recoil from the gray. Arthur's answer was to channel more gray through Nixthar, ignoring the way blood began to flow freely from his eyes and nose as his broken unity strained to maintain the technique. When the exchange concluded, both combatants had been pushed back several meters, their weapons still humming with residual energy, while the ground beneath them bore fresh scars from the overflow of their conflict. But the brief separation revealed something that chilled Gideon to his enhanced core. Where Arthur's gray had made contact with the infernal Armis, tiny cracks had appeared in the artifact's surface. Not damage in the conventional sense, but something far more fundamental, as though the very concept of the artifact's existence was being questioned by forces that operated beyond its classification. Rachel's healing light intensified around Arthur, her face pale with effort as she poured more energy into keeping him functional. The strain of maintaining gray outside his domain was clearly taking its toll, but her support was allowing him to push far beyond what should have been possible. Cecilia's chaos magic swirled around the battlefield in increasingly aggressive patterns, her crimson spells seeking weak points in the connection between Gideon and his artifact. She had recognized the significance of the cracks Arthur had created, and her witchcraft gift was now actively working to exploit them. Reika had recovered from her defensive effort, her cursed script blazing across her skin as she prepared for the next exchange. Additional characters were writing themselves along her arms and legs, enhancing her capabilities in preparation for what promised to be an even more intense confrontation. Now that, Gideon said with satisfaction as he straightened to his full height, his molten axe blazing brighter as he prepared to reveal more of his true capabilities, felt like a proper greeting. The infernal Armis responded to his will by manifesting new layers of destructive potential, reality tears spreading outward from his position like wounds that refused to heal. The artifact had learned from the exchange, adapting its defenses to better counter the threat represented by Arthur's impossible power. But even as Gideon prepared to escalate the confrontation, he couldn't shake the memory of those tiny cracks appearing in his divine weapon. For the first time since his transformation, he felt something he never believed he would experience. Doubt. Chapter 834. Alisara's Gift. The cracks in the infernal Armis had changed everything. What had begun as a test of strength between Arthur and Gideon now carried implications that neither combatant had anticipated. The artifact's divine consciousness recoiled from the gray like a living thing experiencing pain, and that fear manifested as desperate, escalating aggression. "If your power threatens the very existence of my weapon," Gideon said, his voice carrying notes of genuine alarm mixed with growing fury, "then I will ensure you cannot use it." But even as he prepared to escalate their confrontation, new threats materialized from the dimensional distortions surrounding the crater. 3 figures emerged from spatial tiers that opened like wounds in reality itself. The vampire venerables moved with predatory grace that spoke to centuries of accumulated power, their enhanced capabilities placing them at the absolute peak of immortal rank. Alisara's Gift, Gideon observed with satisfaction that bordered on ecstasy. 3 vampire venerables to ensure that your allies cannot interfere with our personal business. The implications hit Arthur like a physical blow. Alisara wasn't just preventing Valen from joining the battle. She was actively ensuring that Arthur would be forced to face the second calamity with minimal support, creating exactly the kind of desperate situation that would push him to his absolute limits. "We have to stop them," Cecilia said, her crimson chaos magic already beginning to flare as she assessed the new threats. "I'm not leaving Arthur," Rachel interrupted firmly, her pure light blazing brighter as she stepped closer to him. "He needs my support to maintain the gray. Without my pure light countering Gideon's corruption, that technique will kill him in minutes." "Rachel's right," Arthur said through gritted teeth, blood streaming from his eyes as his broken unity strained under the impossible load. "I can't sustain this without her pure light healing my body constantly to mitigate the damage from the gray." Cecilia and Reika exchanged a look that carried years of shared combat experience and mutual trust. 2 on 3, Reika said with calm assessment, her cursed script already beginning to blaze across her skin as wings of pure energy spread from her shoulders. "Challenging, but manageable." "We've got this, Arthur," Cecilia said with characteristic confidence, her witchcraft gift already beginning to weave spells that would give them every possible advantage against vampiric opponents. Those bloodsuckers have no idea what they're walking into. Focus on Gideon, Reika added, her enhanced blade appearing in her hands while additional script wrote itself along her arms to boost her physical capabilities. We'll take care of the Venerables. Trust us. The two women moved toward the vampire Venerables with coordinated precision and unwavering confidence. Cecilia's crimson chaos magic creating reality distortions that immediately put the vampires on the defensive, while Reika's enhanced speed allowed her to strike at optimal angles before they could properly coordinate their response, which left Arthur facing a calamity with only Rachel's crucial support. This is what Alisara orchestrated, Arthur realized, feeling the weight of fighting a being of Gideon's caliber with minimal assistance. She's ensuring I'm pushed to my absolute limits while giving me just enough support to make it interesting. Then we give her what she wants, Rachel said, her divine energy intensifying around them both while her superior pure light created zones of purified space where Gideon's reality warping effects were significantly diminished. But we do it on our terms. Arthur's response was to push his summoning capabilities beyond their safe limits. The strain of maintaining Gray outside his domain was already tearing him apart from within, but he needed every advantage he could get. Erebus, Luna. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Darkness coalesced at Arthur's side, not the absence of light but something far more substantial. Shadow given form and purpose, death made beautiful and terrible. The arch-lich that emerged bore the accumulated power of centuries. His 12-foot skeletal frame wrapped in robes that seemed to absorb light itself while the crown of midnight metal upon his skull pulsed with ancient authority. Simultaneously, light that carried the wisdom of millennia materialized, taking the form of a 14-year-old girl whose silver hair and ancient eyes spoke to power that operated according to different principles entirely. Luna's manifestation as a Chelan in human form brought capabilities that transcended normal classifications, but the effort of maintaining both summons while channeling Gray was pushing Arthur's body toward complete breakdown. Master, Erebus intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air tremble with recognition of ancient authority. I stand ready to serve. Arthur? Luna said, her young voice carrying concern that made her ancient nature clear. You're pushing too hard. Your body can't sustain this level of output much longer. It has to, Arthur replied, feeling Valeria pulse through his shadow as the bone symbiote worked frantically to hold his failing form together. Blood was seeping from his eyes, his nose, staining his clothes as his broken unity demanded more from his body than Rachel's healing could fully compensate for. Because the alternative is letting a calamity run free. Gideon's molten eyes tracked the new arrivals with analytical precision, his enhanced capabilities immediately recognizing the threat they represented. Impressive summons, he acknowledged with genuine respect. But even legendary constructs cannot bridge the fundamental gap between mortal and divine. The infernal Armus blazed with renewed intensity, reality tears spreading outward from his position like wounds that refused to heal. But this wasn't random destruction. The artifact was creating a pattern, a web of dimensional instability designed to overwhelm Arthur's enhanced but limited support structure. Let's see how long you can maintain that impossible technique, Gideon said with predatory satisfaction, raising his molten axe while the artifact's power reached new heights of destructive potential. Arthur met his gaze with determination that transcended the agony coursing through his system. Around them, the sounds of Cecilia and Reika's confident engagement with the vampire venerables provided a backdrop of coordinated violence, while Rachel's pure light blazed with intensity that made Gideon's corruption recoil like a living thing experiencing pain. Long enough, Arthur said, raising Nixthar while Gray flowed through the blade in patterns that made the very air shimmer with impossible energy. Chapter 835. Breaking Point. The battle had reached a crescendo that pushed every combatant beyond their previous limits. Arthur Nightingale stood at the center of competing forces, his body wreathed in gray that pulsed with each labored heartbeat, while blood streamed freely from his eyes and nose. The broken unity that allowed him to channel the impossible fusion of deep dark and pure light outside his domain was consuming his life force at an exponential rate. "You're dying," Gideon observed with clinical detachment, his burning eyes tracking the way Arthur's body trembled with each use of gray. "Every technique brings you closer to complete collapse. How much longer can you maintain this charade?" Arthur wiped blood from his mouth, his grip on Nixdar steady despite the agony. Around him, his allies fought with desperate precision. Rachel's pure light blazed in waves that made Gideon's corruption recoil, while Erebus and Luna moved with coordinated grace that spoke to centuries of combat experience. The Arch-Lich flowed like liquid shadow, his 12-foot frame moving with surprising agility as he wove between Gideon's attacks. Erebus didn't engage the calamity directly, the power difference was too vast, but instead worked to create openings for Arthur. His skeletal hands traced patterns in the air that manifested as zones of absolute death, areas where Gideon's enhanced regeneration faltered and his artifact's power fluctuated. Deep dark energy coiled around Erebus's form as he channeled the forbidden magics that defined his nature as an Arch-Lich. Void lances materialized from the shadows, each one carrying enough destructive force to pierce through enhanced armor while simultaneously draining the life force from anything they touched. The spells weren't meant to defeat Gideon. That was impossible. But to disrupt his rhythm and create the tactical advantages Arthur needed. "Eternal Night's Embrace," Erebus intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to darken. Deep dark magic flowed outward in waves that sought to blind Gideon's enhanced senses while simultaneously weakening his connection to the infernal Armus. The technique was masterfully executed, showing why Erebus had earned his legendary classification through centuries of accumulated power. Luna moved like a dancer made of starlight, her small form belying the ancient power she commanded. Where Erebus created zones of negation, she provided moments of clarity, her Chelan nature purifying the corruption that sought to cloud Arthur's judgment, while her presence stabilized the chaotic energies swirling around the battlefield. When Gideon launched a devastating overhead strike, Erebus materialized directly in its path. The Arch-Lich's robes billowed as he raised both hands, deep dark flowing upward to meet the descending axe, barely redirecting the axe just enough to create an opening for Arthur. Luna struck from the opposite side, her small fists wreathed in rainbow light as she targeted pressure points that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her attacks couldn't meaningfully damage a calamity, but they disrupted the flow of power between Gideon and his artifact, creating brief moments where his defenses wavered. But even with their coordinated support, Arthur could feel his strength ebbing away. The gray was magnificent in its power, but it demanded a price his current body could not pay. Still, he had more than just his sword techniques to draw upon. 9 circles of silver light blazed to life around Arthur as he channeled his self-developed Nightingale method, the spellcasting technique he had refined during his time in the demon realm. The circles rotated in complex patterns that defied conventional magical theory, each one inscribed with formulae that optimized mana flow beyond normal parameters. This was a spell Arthur created after fully studying Bahamut's Dragon Heart, his own superior way of casting 9-circle magic. Chains of pure force erupted from the circles, seeking to bind Gideon's movements while simultaneously channeling gray through their structure. The spell work was flawless, executed with the kind of precision that marked true mastery. But even this level of magical sophistication couldn't bridge the fundamental gap between mortal and divine. Arthur felt the familiar frustration building in his chest. He possessed 9-circle magic. He had achieved sword unity with Nixdar. By every conventional measure, he should have been able to break through to Radiant rank, to unlock the true potential that lay just beyond his current grasp. But something was holding him back, some final barrier that his current understanding couldn't overcome. So close, he thought desperately, maintaining the 9-circle array while simultaneously channeling gray through his blade. I can feel it right there, just beyond reach. What am I missing? You cannot win, Gideon continued, batting aside Luna's strike while simultaneously parrying Erebus's follow-up assault. Even if your technique can damage the infernal Armus, you lack the endurance for a prolonged battle. You are fighting a war of attrition against someone who has transcended such limitations. Arthur knew he was right. Each exchange left him weaker while Gideon's power seemed inexhaustible. The cracks that appeared in the artifact when Gray made contact were significant, but they weren't enough. But Arthur Nightingale had not come this far by accepting that limitations were absolute. Then I'll have to use something that doesn't rely on attrition, he said quietly, his voice carrying a quality that made even Gideon pause. Arthur's mind flashed back to his master's final lesson. A strike that could cut open the sky itself, carving through the heavens with power that approached the divine. The fifth movement of his grade 6 art, reserved for those who had transcended every boundary that defined mortal swordsmanship. His mastery wasn't complete, wouldn't be until he achieved true radiant rank. But with Gray flowing through Nixthar, he might be able to touch that impossible level for just a moment. Arthur, Rachel called out, sensing the shift in his energy signature. Whatever you're planning. Trust me, Arthur interrupted, raising Nixthar while Gray flowed through the blade in patterns that made the air itself seem to thicken. Gideon's enhanced perception immediately recognized the threat. The second calamity responded by channeling everything into a preemptive strike, the infernal Armis blazing as he brought his axe down in a devastating arc that could split mountains. Erebus moved like flowing darkness, his skeletal form interposing itself between the axe and Arthur. The Archlich's hands came together in a complex gesture, and deep dark energy erupted outward in patterns that defied mortal comprehension. Legion of the Damned, he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of true necromantic mastery. The space around him filled with spectral warriors, not mere fragments of death, but souls bound to his will through deep dark magic. Each ghostly figure blazed with void-touched energy as they swarmed Gideon's weapon, their sacrificial assault dissipating on contact but slowing the axe's descent by precious milliseconds while draining infinitesimal amounts of power from the infernal Armis. Luna spun in place, her small form becoming a whirlwind of purifying light that struck Gideon from multiple angles simultaneously. Rainbow energy flowed from her fists in patterns that disrupted the calamity's connection to his artifact, making his devastating strike waver just enough to miss its intended target. It was enough. Barely. Arthur completed his preparation and raised Nixthar toward the heavens, Gray flowing through the legendary blade in concentrations that made his entire body convulse in protest. Fifth movement of his grade 6 art. The strike began as a simple vertical cut, Nixthar moving through the air with deceptive casualness. But as the blade reached its apex, something fundamental shifted. Gray exploded outward in patterns that defied conventional understanding, while the technique's true scope became apparent. The sky split. A line of perfect division appeared in the heavens above them, stretching from horizon to horizon as Arthur's technique carved through atmospheric layers and the fabric of space itself. Stars became briefly visible through the opening, while the edges glowed with gray that refused conventional containment. The attack descended toward Gideon with the weight of heaven behind it, carrying power that operated on scales normally reserved for demigods. The air itself seemed to part in reverence as the technique approached its target. Gideon's eyes widened with genuine terror. The infernal Armis blazed with desperate power as it manifested every defensive capability, while the body aspect of the heavenly demon reinforced his form to withstand continent-shattering impacts. The technique struck with a sound like the world's heartbeat stopping. Mythical-grade artifact and impossible technique ground against each other in a display that challenged fundamental laws. Gray carved into the infernal Armis, creating a network of cracks that spread across its surface like lightning frozen in metal, while the artifact's accumulated power fought to maintain coherence. When the exchange concluded, both combatants stood motionless, the weight of what had occurred settling over the battlefield. Then Gideon smiled. Magnificent! He breathed, genuine appreciation in his voice despite the cracks covering his artifact. You actually damaged a weapon with a technique that should be impossible at your level. But the infernal Armis pulsed once, and the cracks began to seal as the artifact drew upon reserves that transcended normal understanding. The damage was significant, but not permanent. But it wasn't enough, Arthur whispered, feeling his strength finally give out as the technique's completion left him utterly drained. Gideon's counterattack came with the fury of someone genuinely threatened for the first time. The molten axe carved through the air in a strike that promised to end everything, while the infernal Armis channeled power that sought to impose absolute destruction. Arthur tried to raise Nixthar in defense, but his body betrayed him. His muscles, pushed beyond breaking by the strain of channeling Grey, simply refused to respond. His vision blurred as his broken unity finally collapsed completely. The axe struck with mountain-shattering force, launching Arthur's body across the battlefield like a broken doll. He felt ribs crack, felt organs rupture under the tremendous impact, felt consciousness beginning to fade as his form approached complete failure. He was falling, the ground rushing up with fatal certainty, when something impossible happened. A single crimson thread caught him. Not rope or chain, but a strand that looked like crystallized light, materializing from nowhere to wrap around his torso with gentle precision. The thread stopped his descent as easily as if he weighed nothing, holding him suspended while its surface pulsed with inexplicable energies. Gideon's follow-up attack came immediately, the molten axe carving toward Arthur's helpless form with enough power to end the fight permanently. But when the weapon struck the crimson thread, something unprecedented occurred. Nothing happened. The infernal Armis, one of the 7 most powerful artifacts in existence, simply could not cut through the delicate strand. The axe's edge, wielded by a transcendent being, met the thread and stopped as though it had struck something fundamentally immutable. "What?" Gideon breathed, striking again and again, each blow failing to even scratch the strand's surface. "What power dares interfere with my authority?" But the thread offered no explanation. It simply held Arthur suspended above the battlefield, pulsing with quiet confidence that suggested its presence was both intentional and absolute. Arthur's consciousness hung by the same delicate strand that supported his body, his vision fading as his shattered form struggled to maintain function. Through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, he felt something stirring in the depths of his being. Not the broken unity that had failed him, but something else entirely. Chapter 836. Return to the beginning. The transition was seamless, like stepping from one nightmare into another. One moment I was suspended above the battlefield by that impossible crimson thread, my body broken and my consciousness fading, and the next I found myself standing in a space that defied normal understanding. Alisara Velcroix's realm stretched around me, a dimension she had shaped according to her will. The ground beneath my feet felt solid enough, made of what looked like crystallized starlight that pulsed with an alien rhythm. The sky remained deep purple twilight, while crimson threads wove through the air like veins of power. And there she stood, perhaps 10 feet away. Those jade-green eyes held Emma's memories, but they burned with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her pink hair cascaded with perfection that had never existed naturally, her features carrying Emma's beauty, but refined beyond human limitation. This was Alisara Velcroix, the woman who had saved me from certain death years ago before leaving Earth to grow stronger. Now she had returned as something that could make even calamities seem insignificant by comparison. "Arthur?" she breathed, and I heard Emma's voice wrapped in something that made the air itself seem heavy. "My Arthur, look what they've done to you." The way she said it, "my Arthur," carried possessive weight that made me take an involuntary step back. Emma's love had been genuine, warm, human. This was those same feelings twisted through power until devotion had become obsession. "Alisara," I said carefully, "you've grown stronger. Strong enough to reshape reality itself," she replied, stepping closer with movements that seemed to bend space around her. "But do you know what I thought about during every moment of that transformation? You. Emma's memories of you. The way you used to smile at her. The sound of your voice when you said her name." She moved with predatory grace, each step calculated to close the distance between us. I could see Emma's mannerisms in her movements, but they were wrong, too perfect, too intentional. Like someone had studied recordings and practiced until they could replicate them flawlessly. "Every night, I would replay her memories of your conversations," Alisara continued, her eyes never leaving my face. "The way you would tease her, The exact expression you wore when you first told her you cared about her. The clinical precision with which she catalogued those moments was disturbing. These weren't fond remembrances. They were obsessive fixations. Emma's cherished memories twisted into fuel for something unhealthy. "Those weren't your memories," I said quietly. "They are now," she replied with fervent intensity. "I am everything Emma was, plus everything she needed to be worthy of you. Her love, her devotion, her dreams. All of it refined through power until it became something eternal. Emma's memories, filtered through this entity's growing power until love had curdled into something monstrous. She remembered caring for me, but understood it only as possession, protection only as control. Send me back to the battlefield. Her perfect features twisted with immediate rejection. Absolutely not. You're broken, Arthur. Gideon will kill you. That's my choice to make. No, she said with finality that made her realm pulse with responding energy. I won't let you die. I won't let you suffer when I have the power to prevent it. Emma's greatest fear was losing you, and I have the strength to ensure that never happens. She stepped even closer, and I could see the way her jade eyes reflected my image dozens of times over, like I was trapped in a hall of mirrors designed by someone who collected reflections of things they desired. Don't you understand? She whispered. I can keep you safe forever. No more battles, no more pain, no more risk of losing everything that matters. Just us, together, in a place where nothing can hurt you. The offer should have been tempting. After years of fighting, of constantly looking over my shoulder for the next threat, the idea of safety held a certain appeal. But the price she was asking, my freedom, my right to choose my own path, was one I could never pay. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of my battered body even in this space beyond physical limitation. She was right about my condition. I was in no shape to face a calamity. But returning to Rachel for healing would take time we didn't have, and my team was struggling without me. But maybe that wasn't the real problem. I thought about my sword. Not Nixthar with its legendary capabilities or the complex techniques I had developed over years of training. Just a sword. A simple length of metal designed for cutting through obstacles. In my mind, I began to swing. Basic forms I had learned as a child, movements so fundamental that they existed below conscious thought. The memory of steel cutting through air, the feeling of proper edge alignment, the rhythm of practice swings repeated until they became second nature. The first swing was clumsy, my mental sword work rusty from years of focusing on advanced techniques. But something about the simplicity felt right, like returning to a foundation I had built everything else upon. Gray began to respond, not to complex manipulation or forced techniques, but to the simple truth of what a sword was meant to do. Cut. Nothing more, nothing less. You're thinking about fighting, Alisara observed, her voice carrying notes of fascination and horror. Even broken, even facing impossible odds, you're still planning to fight. I kept my eyes closed, continuing the mental sword work. Each swing stripped away unnecessary complexity, each cut revealing the fundamental truth beneath years of accumulated technique. The second swing was cleaner than the first. The third, smoother still. Gray wasn't something foreign to be controlled. It was recognition of what lay between extremes, the space where balance existed not as compromise but as transcendence of opposition itself. I had been trying to force it into patterns that made sense to me, when I should have been letting it teach me what lay beyond conventional understanding. My mental blade moved through another form, and I felt something click into place. Not breakthrough, not yet, but comprehension of the path forward. To reach Radiant rank, I needed to stop trying to make Gray conform to my expectations and instead allow it to show me what was possible. I can see it in your expression, Alisara said softly. That determination that made Emma fall in love with you in the first place. But also the stubbornness that terrified her, the way you would choose principle over safety every single time. Her voice carried a mixture of admiration and frustration that felt disturbingly familiar. Emma had said similar things during our relationship, though never with the possessive undertones that colored Alisara's words. When you're strong enough to stand beside me, Alisara began. No, I interrupted. opening my eyes to meet her gaze directly. I will never be what you want me to be, and keeping me here against my will makes you no different from any other tyrant. Her jade eyes widened with something that might have been genuine shock. I'm protecting you. You're controlling me, I replied with quiet firmness. Just like Emma's memories are probably telling you I hate being controlled. For the first time since entering her realm, I saw uncertainty flicker across her features. Emma's memories would indeed confirm that I had always valued freedom above safety, choice above protection. She had learned that lesson the hard way during our relationship, when her attempts to keep me safe from dangerous missions had nearly driven us apart. Emma learned to love me as I was, I continued, not as she wanted me to be. That's what made her special. She understood that trying to change someone destroys the very thing you claim to love about them. Alisara's perfect composure cracked slightly, confusion warring with obsessive certainty in her expression. But I have the power to keep you safe. Emma didn't. Emma had to watch helplessly while you threw yourself into danger. And that fear, that helplessness, that was part of what made her human, I said. Part of what made her love worth having. You've taken that away and convinced yourself it was an improvement. The realm around us trembled as she processed the fundamental contradiction between her desire to protect me and her inherited knowledge that protection without consent was just another form of cage. Send me back, I said with absolute finality. Not because you want to, but because keeping me here makes you exactly what I've spent my life fighting against. You'll die, she whispered, and for a moment I heard genuine anguish in her voice. Not for her own loss, but for mine. Maybe, I acknowledged, but that's my choice to make. In my mind, I continued the sword work. Each mental swing brought greater clarity, greater understanding of the path I needed to take. Gray flowed through the imaginary blade with increasing harmony, showing me glimpses of what lay beyond my current limitations. For a long moment, Alisara stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, her power began to shift the realm around us. When this is over, she said quietly, remember that someone cared enough to let you go, even when every instinct screamed to keep you safe. The crystallized starlight beneath my feet began to fade, the purple twilight giving way to the harsh reality of the battlefield. But just before the transition completed, I felt her power touch my damaged body. Not healing, which would have been control, but a gentle stabilization that would buy me precious minutes before my injuries became critical. Then I was back, suspended above the battlefield by that crimson thread, feeling my broken ribs and damaged organs with renewed clarity. But something fundamental had changed during my time in her realm. Not breakthrough, not yet, but understanding. For the first time since our confrontation began, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Chapter 837, Crown of Twilight. I lifted Nixthar and began to swing. The first movement was basic, a simple vertical cut that I had performed 10,000 times in practice. But something was different. Instead of trying to channel Gray through complex patterns or force it into techniques I had learned, I simply let the energy flow naturally through the blade as it carved through the air. Finally ready to die properly? Gideon asked with amusement, his molten axe pulsing with increased intensity. I was beginning to think that woman would keep you locked away forever. I didn't respond, focusing entirely on the sword in my hands. The second swing followed the first, a horizontal slash that cut through the space where Gideon's miasma hung thickest. Where the blade passed, the corruption didn't just dissipate. It transformed, becoming something neutral, balanced. That was new. Arthur, Rachel called from behind me, her pure light intensifying around both of us. Your injuries. I can manage, I replied without taking my eyes off Gideon. The stabilization Alisara had provided would hold for a while, and I could feel Rachel's healing energy working to repair the worst of the damage. But more importantly, I could feel Gray responding to my sword work in ways it never had before. The third swing revealed something crucial. I wasn't just moving a sword. I was expressing intention through steel, cutting away not just physical obstacles but conceptual ones. Each movement stripped away another layer of unnecessary complexity, bringing me closer to the fundamental truth of what I was trying to achieve. Gideon's patience ran out. Enough games. The infernal Armis erupted with power that made his previous attacks look like gentle probes. His axe split into multiple weapons, not physical duplicates, but manifestations of the artifact's ability to exist in several states simultaneously. Each phantom axe carried the full destructive potential of the original, creating a web of destruction that filled the space between us. I met the first strike with Nixthar, gray flowing through the blade with unprecedented clarity. My sword unity, achieved months ago, allowed perfect harmony between myself and the legendary weapon. But now I felt something deeper stirring, not just unity with my sword, but with the very essence of what I was becoming. The impact should have shattered my arms, but instead I felt the force redistribute itself through my entire body, then flow harmlessly into the ground. The second phantom axe swept toward my damaged ribs, and I had to twist desperately to avoid a killing blow, the weapon's edge passing close enough to part the fabric of my shirt. The fourth swing taught me about timing, not the mechanical precision of practiced forms, but the deeper rhythm that governed all conflict, the space between heartbeats where decisions were made, where victory and defeat balanced on the edge of possibility. Rachel's pure light manifested as barriers of crystallized light around Gideon, each construct designed to limit his mobility while providing me with tactical advantages. But the second calamity had grown tired of restraint. The infernal Armis responded to his will by manifesting not just heat and cutting force, but concepts drawn from the artifact's accumulated understanding of destruction. Ruin, collapse, the inevitable decay that claimed all things. My fifth swing cut through those concepts like they were merely illusions, Gray asserting that decay was not inevitable, that between creation and destruction lay the space where renewal was possible. The philosophical battle between his artifact and my understanding created sparks of discharged energy that painted the battlefield in impossible colors. But it still wasn't enough. Gideon's power continued to escalate, and I could feel the pressure of fighting a being whose capabilities transcended normal limitations. Rachel was doing everything she could to support me, but we were severely outnumbered in terms of raw combat power. Is this all the legendary Arthur Nightingale has to offer? Gideon taunted, his burning eyes tracking my movements with predatory interest. I expected more from the man who killed my father. The mention of the Axe King sparked something in my memory, not anger, but recognition. I had defeated that calamity not through overwhelming force, but by understanding what lay at the heart of his obsession with strength. Every enemy I had truly defeated had fallen not to superior power, but to superior understanding. My sixth swing revealed the next layer of truth. Gray wasn't just about balance between opposing forces, it was about transcending the need for opposition entirely. Not finding compromise between light and dark, but existing in the space where such distinctions became irrelevant. The realization sent shock waves through my body, and I felt something fundamental beginning to shift. My sword unity had been the beginning, but this was something far greater, complete unity not just with my weapon, but with the very nature of existence itself. There, Gideon said with satisfaction, his enhanced senses detecting the change in my energy patterns. Now you're beginning to show your true nature. His axe moved in a pattern that seemed to cut through multiple dimensions simultaneously, each strike leaving persistent wounds in reality that hung in the air like frozen lightning. But instead of trying to avoid them all, I moved through them, my seventh swing teaching me that some obstacles could only be overcome by accepting them as part of the path forward. Pain flared through my damaged ribs as one of the dimensional cuts caught me, but the injury felt distant, irrelevant compared to the growing clarity in my mind. Each swing of my sword was stripping away another limitation, another assumption about what was possible when someone truly understood the nature of the space between extremes. Arthur, behind you! Rachel's warning came just in time for me to spin away from another phantom axe, but the movement sent agony through my battered torso. Her healing was helping, but it couldn't keep up with the accumulating damage from fighting someone of Gideon's caliber. My eighth swing brought revelation about the nature of unity itself. Sword unity had been about perfect harmony between wielder and weapon, but that was only the first step. True unity meant understanding that the sword, the swordsman, the enemy, the battlefield. All of it was part of the same greater whole. Impressive, Rachel said through gritted teeth, her pure light barriers barely holding against Gideon's escalating assault. But whatever you're doing, do it faster. He's not holding back anymore. She was right. The second calamity had abandoned all pretense of restraint, the infernal Armis manifesting abilities that defied easy categorization. Space folded around him like origami, time stuttered and jumped in his immediate vicinity, and the very concepts that defined reality began to bend according to his will. But my understanding was deepening with each swing. The ninth cut taught me about intention, not the simple desire to win or survive, but the fundamental purpose that drove all meaningful action. The 10th revealed the connection between will and manifestation, showing me how thought became reality when filtered through sufficient understanding. I can't hold this forever, Rachel warned, sweat beading on her forehead from the effort of maintaining her barriers while healing me simultaneously. Whatever you're building toward, it needs to happen soon. My 11th swing brought me to the edge of something profound. Gray flowed through Nixthar and through me with perfect harmony, but more than that, it flowed through everything. The battlefield, the air, the space between heartbeats. I could feel the fundamental equation that governed all existence beginning to resolve itself in my consciousness. The 12th swing was different. As Nixthar completed its arc, I felt something click into place, not just in my technique or my understanding, but in my very being. The gray energy that had been flowing through me suddenly crystallized into something far more substantial. A weight settled on my head, not physical but conceptual. I could feel it there, invisible to normal sight but undeniably real. Power flowed through it and from it, connecting me to every aspect of the battle around me. Rachel gasped behind me, "Arthur, your head." Gideon's confident expression faltered for the first time since our confrontation began. His burning eyes widened as they focused on something above my brow that shouldn't have been there. "Impossible," he breathed. I could feel it now, the crown of twilight, made of pure gray energy, manifesting as the visible symbol of complete unity achieved. Not just unity with my sword or my power, but with the fundamental nature of existence itself. The space between extremes made manifest, worn like a crown by someone who had finally understood what it truly meant to transcend limitation without abandoning purpose. The battlefield fell silent as both allies and enemies stared at the impossible sight. Gray energy cascaded around me like liquid starlight, but it was controlled now, purposeful. Every particle served the greater harmony while maintaining its individual nature. For the first time since I had begun to understand gray, I felt truly ready to face a calamity. "Now," I said quietly, and my voice carried undertones that made reality itself pay attention. "Let's finish this." Chapter 838. Mother and Daughter. The spatial barrier that separated their battle from the main conflict shimmered like heat waves, but within its boundaries, a confrontation that had been years in the making finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Evelyn Alaric stood at the center of a garden of nightmares, black roses blooming around her in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Each flower carried 9-circle magical construction, petals edged with corruption that sought to drain life from anything they touched. As a low radiant rank mage, she possessed power that transcended normal human limitations, but it was the twisted maternal obsession in her eyes that made her truly dangerous. "My beautiful daughter," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem heavy with possessive hunger. "Look how strong you've become. I taught you well." Rose stood opposite the woman who had birthed her into a world of calculated cruelty. Blue roses bloomed around her like guardians made of crystallized impossibility, their petals shimmering with the power of paradox itself. Her gift manifested as reality bending around the flowers, physics weeping in surrender, as order and chaos danced together in perfect harmony. "You taught me exactly what I never wanted to become," Rose replied with deadly calm, her businesslike demeanor intact despite the emotional weight of the confrontation. "Which makes this conversation unnecessary." Beside her, Seraphina moved with the fluid grace that marked someone who had mastered the Mount Hua sword arts. Ice magic flowed around her sword like crystallized moonlight, her elven heritage manifesting as perfect harmony between blade work and elemental control. Where Rose's power operated on principles of paradox, Seraphina's was pure elegance. Each movement a work of art that happened to be capable of killing continental-level combatants. Still so cold, so distant, Evelyn continued, taking a step closer as more black roses manifested around her. I gave you everything: power, knowledge, the strength to survive in a world that would have destroyed a weaker child. And this is how you repay me. The black roses moved with predatory intelligence, weaving through the space between the combatants while their thorns promised death to anyone foolish enough to make contact. But they met an unexpected obstacle as Rose's blue roses materialized to intercept them, the two forces colliding in mid-air with a sound like reality tearing. Where the black roses carried corruption and the desire to possess, the blue ones radiated something far more complex: the power to transform opposition into harmony, malevolence into protective energy. The paradox gift didn't just destroy Evelyn's attacks. It reversed their very nature, turning her mother's weapons against her with elegant precision. You gave me nothing, Rose said, her eight-circle magical construction manifesting as increasingly complex patterns of blue roses. You created a weapon and convinced yourself it was motherhood. Evelyn's perfect features twisted with something that might have been genuine hurt, if genuine emotions were still possible for someone who had embraced corruption so completely. I protected you. I made you strong enough to survive, to thrive, to become everything I could never be. You tortured me, Rose corrected with matter-of-fact precision that somehow carried more emotional weight than screaming would have. You broke me down and rebuilt me according to your specifications. You turned love into control and convinced yourself it was the same thing. The battle escalated as Evelyn's nine-circle capabilities came into full display. Her black roses multiplied exponentially, creating a tide of corruption that sought to overwhelm her daughter through sheer numerical advantage. Each flower carried enough destructive potential to level city blocks, while their collective presence warped reality according to concepts of possession and domination. But Rose had grown beyond her mother's expectations. Her paradox gift manifested as blue roses that didn't just match the black ones numerically. They transformed the fundamental nature of the conflict itself. Where Evelyn sought to overwhelm, Rose created balance. Where corruption tried to spread, paradox imposed harmony. You cannot deny what you are, Evelyn snarled, her maternal obsession finally showing its true face. You are mine, my creation, my masterpiece, my perfect daughter. I will not let you waste yourself on these people who don't understand your true potential. I am not yours, Rose replied with finality that made the barrier around them ring like a struck bell. I never was. I was a person you tried to shape into a possession, and I reject everything you tried to make me become. Seraphina chose that moment to strike, her blade tracing patterns in the air that left brief tears in spacetime. The Mount Hua blossoming arts manifested as sword techniques that resembled flower petals dancing on the wind, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next while ice magic added lethal precision to every cut. Her intervention came at the perfect moment, disrupting Evelyn's focus just as the older woman prepared to deploy her most dangerous techniques. Frost spread across the black roses wherever Seraphina's blade touched them, the ice magic working to counteract their corrupting influence, while her sword work carved through their defensive formations. Stay out of this, Evelyn snapped, turning part of her attention toward the elven woman. This is between me and my daughter. Rose chose to make it our business, Seraphina replied with ice-cold precision, her blade continuing its deadly dance while more frost gathered around her. Which means it became our business. The three-way battle reached new levels of intensity as Evelyn's radiant rank power fully manifested. Her black roses evolved beyond simple weapons, becoming concepts given form, the idea of possession made manifest, the notion of ownership transformed into attacking entities. Each bloom carried the weight of her obsession, her absolute certainty that Rose belonged to her by right of creation. But Rose had found something her mother never possessed: genuine connection with others. Her blue roses responded not just to her individual will, but to the harmony she had built with her companions. Seraphina's ice magic began to intermingle with the paradox gift, creating hybrid attacks that combined elemental precision with reality-warping impossibility. "You think these people care about you?" Evelyn demanded, her voice carrying notes of desperate rage as her attacks failed to achieve the overwhelming victory she had expected. "They use you for your power just like everyone else. Only I love you for what you truly are. You love the weapon you tried to create," Rose corrected, her blue roses spreading outward in defensive formations that transformed her mother's garden of nightmares into something resembling actual beauty. "You have no idea who I truly am, because you never bothered to find out." The emotional warfare was as brutal as the physical combat. Every exchange revealed new layers of psychological damage, years of manipulation and control laid bare through the language of magical violence. Evelyn's attacks carried the weight of twisted maternal devotion, while Rose's defenses expressed the hard-won freedom of someone who had learned to define herself on her own terms. Seraphina's role in the battle evolved from simple support to something more profound. Her ice magic didn't just complement Rose's paradox roses. It provided grounding, stability, the kind of unshakable foundation that allowed someone to stand firm against overwhelming emotional manipulation. "I made you strong," Evelyn insisted, her black roses beginning to show signs of strain as they met increasingly sophisticated defenses. "Everything you are, everything you can do. It exists because I had the strength to do what was necessary." "You made me survive," Rose acknowledged with brutal honesty. "But I made myself strong. I chose to become something other than what you intended, and that choice is what defines me." The battle reached its crescendo as both mother and daughter deployed their ultimate techniques. Evelyn's 9-circle magic manifested as a black rose garden, each bloom carrying enough corrupting influence to twist reality according to her possessive desires. Rose's response was to embrace the full scope of her paradox gift. Blue roses bloomed not just around her, but throughout the entire space, each one asserting that harmony was possible even in the face of absolute opposition. The very nature of the conflict began to transform as paradox imposed its will on corrupted obsession. But just as the climactic exchange threatened to tear the barrier apart entirely, something changed on the battlefield beyond. A presence that transcended normal classification suddenly manifested, drawing the attention of all three combatants despite the intensity of their personal war. Rose felt at first power that operated on principles she recognized but had never seen implemented with such perfect precision. Her blue roses trembled in sympathetic resonance, as gray energy manifested somewhere beyond their isolated battle space. Seraphina's ice magic responded similarly, frost crystals forming patterns that spoke to fundamental forces being wielded with unprecedented control. Her elven heritage allowed her to sense the deeper harmonies at work, the way reality itself was being reshaped by someone who had finally understood what lay beyond conventional limitation. Even Evelyn paused in her obsessive assault, her black roses faltering as her enhanced senses detected something that challenged her understanding of what was possible. Her burning gaze turned toward the barrier that separated them from the main battlefield, where impossible energies were beginning to manifest. "Arthur?" Rose whispered, and her voice carried notes of recognition and something that might have been awe. The crown of twilight had begun to manifest, and its presence was felt across every corner of the space that contained their conflicts. Chapter 839, Vampire Venerables. The abandoned industrial district provided the perfect backdrop for a confrontation that would leave nothing but rubble in its wake. Massive concrete structures rose like tombstones around the combatants, their surfaces stained with decades of rust and decay that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the presence of the three figures waiting with predatory patience. The vampire venerables had chosen their battleground well, a space where the accumulated despair of failed dreams and broken lives had seeped into the very foundations, creating an atmosphere that amplified their connection to miasma and the darker aspects of existence. Cecilia stepped through the maze of broken machinery with crimson energy already coalescing around her hands, her witchcraft gift responding to the oppressive atmosphere by manifesting chaos magic that made reality itself seem unstable. Beside her, Reika moved with fluid precision, dark ink flowing across her exposed skin in intricate script that enhanced her physical capabilities beyond normal human limitations. Arthur Nightingale's companions, observed the first vampire, a lean figure whose pale features carried the kind of predatory beauty that spoke to centuries of refined hunting. I am Vex, and I've been looking forward to adding your blood to my collection. His companions flanked him with movements that defied normal physics. One a woman whose form seemed to blur between solid matter and living shadow, the other a broad-shouldered man whose eyes burned with hunger that transcended simple bloodlust. Nira, the shadow woman, introduced herself with a voice like whispered nightmares. I prefer to feed in the spaces between consciousness and death. Thane, grunted the third vampire, his massive frame radiating brute power that had been refined through millennia of violence. I enjoy the hunt almost as much as the feast. Cecilia's response was to unleash a wave of chaotic energy that transformed the industrial wasteland's atmosphere into something resembling a storm caught in a kaleidoscope. Her eight-circle magical construction manifested as crimson lightning that didn't just carry destructive force. It rewrote the fundamental laws governing the space it passed through, turning predictable physics into something that changed according to her subconscious desires. Less talking, more dying, she said with characteristic directness, her chaos magic spreading outward in patterns that made the concrete structures ripple like water. Reika's preparation was more subtle but no less impressive. Cursed script flowed across her arms and shoulders in living tattoos that glowed with inner fire, each character enhancing a different aspect of her physical capabilities. Strength, speed, reflexes, endurance, all pushed beyond mortal limitations through techniques that turned her own body into a weapon worthy of facing continental-level threats. The sword that appeared in her hands hummed with potential energy as she assumed the opening stance of the martial king's legendary art. The Grade 6 sword technique had been created by someone who understood that true mastery meant transcending the limitations of conventional blade work, reaching into the realm where philosophy became physics. First movement, she said quietly, her enhanced muscles coiling with power that made the air around her shimmer. Skybreaker. The attack launched with such devastating force that it seemed to tear reality apart along its path. Reika's blade traced an ascending arc that carried enough kinetic energy to split mountains, while the cursed script on her skin blazed brighter as it channeled power beyond what her normal physiology should have been able to contain. But the vampire venerables hadn't survived centuries of existence by being easy to kill. Domain expansion, Vex declared with anticipation that bordered on ecstasy. Crimson harvest. The world around them transformed into something from a predator's paradise. The industrial wasteland became a vast feeding ground where every surface wept blood-red miasma, and the very air grew thick with crimson mist that carried the scent of iron and hunger. Within this domain, Vex's connection to blood magic reached transcendent levels, every drop of the red miasma responding to his will like extensions of his own circulatory system. Reika's devastating attack met barriers of crystallized blood miasma that didn't just absorb the impact. They transformed it into nourishment that actually strengthened Vex's domain. The crimson mist began to swirl faster, forming predatory shapes that moved with independent intelligence. Exquisite technique, Vex purred, his pale features taking on a healthier flush as he fed on the violence. Your dedication will make the eventual feeding that much more satisfying. Nira's response was to activate her own domain. Domain expansion. Endless twilight. Reality twisted as perpetual dusk descended on the battlefield. But this wasn't simple darkness. The twilight carried weight, substance, turning shadows into solid matter that moved according to Nira's predatory instincts. Within her domain, she could manifest anywhere darkness touched, while her enemies found their perceptions constantly shifted and manipulated. Can you fight what you cannot properly see? She whispered from everywhere and nowhere, her voice seeming to come from the spaces between thoughts. Cecilia's chaos magic responded by manifesting light that operated according to principles of controlled madness, illumination that revealed what shouldn't be visible while casting shadows where none should exist. Her witchcraft gift allowed her to impose her own chaotic rules on the vampire's domains, creating pockets of space where their control was challenged by pure unpredictability. Found you, Cecilia said with grim satisfaction, her crimson energy lashing out toward a patch of twilight that seemed too deep for the available illumination. Meanwhile, Thane decided subtlety was overrated. Domain expansion. Apex predator. His domain manifested as something primal and terrifying, a hunting ground where the fundamental rules of predator and prey became law. Within this space, Thane's physical capabilities were enhanced beyond normal limitation. While his opponents found themselves marked as prey, their movements tracked and predicted through instincts honed across millennia of successful hunts. The three domains overlapped and interfered with each other, creating a battlefield that existed according to multiple contradictory rules simultaneously. Blood miasma mixed with living twilight while predatory instincts clashed with chaotic impossibility. Reika met the combined assault with the second movement of the martial king's art. Earth Rend, she called out, her blade sweeping horizontally in a cut that carried enough force to split continents. The cursed script covering her body flared brighter as it channeled power through techniques that turned flesh and bone into something approaching divine weaponry. The attack carved through all three domains simultaneously, her enhanced blade refusing to be limited by the vampire's reality-warping abilities. Where her sword passed, the overlapping domains cracked like broken glass, revealing glimpses of normal space beneath their constructed realities. But the vampires adapted quickly. Vex blood miasma began to flow around the cracks, sealing them with crimson power that fed on the violence of the exchange. Nira's twilight shifted to accommodate the damage, while Thane's predatory instincts guided him to exploit the openings created by his companion's techniques. The battle escalated as all three vampires began to push their domains to their limits. Vex manifested blood constructs that moved with predatory intelligence, each crimson creation designed to drain life force from anything it touched. Nira's shadow manipulation reached new levels of sophistication, allowing her to attack from multiple angles simultaneously while remaining effectively untouchable within her twilight realm. Thane's enhanced strength combined with supernatural hunting instincts, turning him into an apex predator that tracked his enemy's movements with impossible precision. Reika responded by accessing deeper levels of the martial king's art. Third movement, Ocean's Wrath, she announced, her blade flowing through patterns that seemed to bring the power of tsunamis to bear against her opponents. The cursed script covering her skin had spread to include her face and neck, turning her into something that resembled a living weapon more than a human being. The attack manifested as waves of cutting force that filled the overlapping domains, each surge carrying enough power to carve through reinforced reality like it was soft wood. But more than simple destruction, the technique carried the relentless persistence of water, flowing around obstacles, finding weaknesses, wearing down resistance through inexorable pressure. Cecilia's chaos magic reached new heights of controlled madness as she embraced the full scope of her witchcraft gift. Her eight-circle construction manifested as reality storms that didn't just attack her enemies, they infected their domains with pure unpredictability. Gravity became negotiable, time flowed in irregular patterns, and the laws of physics bent according to her subconscious desires, creating chaos within the vampire's carefully constructed realities. Fourth movement, Heaven's Judgment, Reika continued, her sword technique evolving as the cursed script on her skin blazed with increasing intensity. This strike carried not just physical force, but conceptual weight, the idea of justice made manifest through perfectly executed blade work. The combined assault of chaos magic and transcendent swordsmanship began to overwhelm even the vampire's domain expansions. Cracks appeared in their overlapping realities as forces beyond their control imposed themselves on the battlefield. Enough games, Vex snarled, his predatory composure finally cracking as he realized these opponents were far more dangerous than anticipated. Kill them quickly before they... His words were cut off as something changed in the atmosphere around them. A presence that transcended normal classification suddenly manifested, drawing the attention of all five combatants despite the intensity of their conflict. Reika felt it first through the cursed script covering her skin, the characters beginning to resonate with frequencies that spoke to power operating on principles she recognized but had never experienced directly. Her grip on her sword tightened as she sensed gray energy manifesting somewhere beyond their battlefield. Cecilia's chaos magic responded similarly, crimson energy forming patterns that spoke to fundamental forces being wielded with unprecedented control. Her witchcraft gift allowed her to perceive the deeper harmonies at work, the way reality itself was being reshaped by someone who had finally understood what lay beyond conventional limitation. Even the vampire's domains flickered as their enhanced senses detected something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Vex's crimson harvest wavered, Nira's endless twilight stuttered, and Thane's predatory instincts screamed warnings about power that operated outside their comprehension. The crown of twilight was beginning to manifest, and its presence resonated across every corner of the battlefield where his allies fought for their lives. Chapter 840. Ascension. The crown of twilight blazed above Arthur Nightingale's brow like a constellation given form, its gray radiance casting impossible shadows across the battlefield. Reality itself seemed to bend slightly around the manifestation, acknowledging something that transcended normal classification. For the first time since their confrontation began, Gideon's burning eyes reflected something that might have been genuine uncertainty. Impossible, the second calamity breathed, his enhanced senses struggling to process what he was witnessing. No mortal should be capable of manifesting. His words died as Arthur moved with fluid precision that belonged to someone who had finally understood the fundamental nature of their own existence. Nixthar carved through the air in patterns that seemed to rewrite the laws governing space and time, gray energy flowing through the legendary blade as naturally as blood through veins. The first exchange revealed the depth of Arthur's transformation. Where before he had fought to understand gray, now he wielded it with the certainty of someone who had transcended the need for conscious control. His sword met Gideon's molten axe with force that sent shockwaves through the crater. But this time Arthur didn't just survive the impact, he dominated it. Gray energy cascaded along the infernal Armis's surface wherever Nixthar made contact, and the artifact's accumulated corruption recoiled like a living thing experiencing pain. The cracks that had appeared during their earlier exchanges began to spread, reality-warping power meeting something that operated on principles beyond simple opposition. "You're different?" Gideon snarled, his transformed features twisting with rage as he channeled more power through the divine artifact. "But a crown doesn't make you a god." The molten axe erupted with abilities that transcended his previous limitations. Dimensional cuts opened throughout the battlefield as the infernal Armis manifested its capacity to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Each phantom weapon carried devastating potential, creating a web of destruction that sought to overwhelm Arthur through sheer impossibility. But Arthur's response revealed the true scope of his metamorphosis. Instead of defending against the multidimensional assault, he moved through it like water flowing around obstacles. His understanding of gray had evolved beyond technique into something approaching divine intuition. Each swing of Nixthar created pathways where none should exist, carving spaces of possibility through Gideon's reality-warping attacks. "Rachel?" Arthur called without taking his eyes off the calamity, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to resonate. "You can stop now. I've got this." The Saintess of the North hesitated for a moment, her pure light still blazing around them both. But something in Arthur's tone, not arrogance but absolute certainty, made her slowly lower her hands. The healing energy that had sustained him throughout their battle began to fade, leaving Arthur to face the second calamity with nothing but his own transformed capabilities. And it was enough. Power flowed through Arthur's body with unprecedented control, his body restructuring itself to accommodate forces that operated on radiant rank principles. This wasn't the overwhelming torrent he had struggled to contain before. It was purposeful, harmonious, each particle of gray energy serving the greater balance while maintaining its individual nature. Gideon's desperation manifested as a reality-sundering assault. Domain expansion, infernal sovereignty. The world around them transformed into something from a god's nightmare. Space folded according to principles of absolute destruction, while the very air became molten with corruption. Within this domain, Gideon's connection to the infernal Armis reached transcendent levels, every molecule of existence responding to concepts of ruin and inevitable decay. But the crown of twilight blazed brighter in response, gray energy not fighting against the domain but transcending it entirely. Arthur created pockets of balanced space where destruction and creation existed in perfect harmony, his understanding allowing him to impose natural order on the calamity's twisted reality. Fourth movement. World's Edge, Arthur announced, his voice carrying weight that made Gideon's domain ring like a struck bell. The technique manifested as a sword strike that seemed to cut through the fundamental nature of existence itself. Not destroying the calamity's reality but revealing the truth beneath all constructed realities. The space where choice was possible, where balance could be achieved through wisdom rather than force. Gray energy followed the blade's path like a tide of controlled impossibility, carving through Gideon's domain with surgical precision. For the first time since manifesting his divine transformation, the second calamity staggered backward, genuine fear flickering across his enhanced features. "What are you becoming?" he demanded, his burning gaze fixed on the crown that pulsed with each of Arthur's heartbeats. "Someone who chooses to remain human despite transcending mortal limitations," Arthur replied, and his words carried sufficient force to make reality itself pause in acknowledgement. The transformation continued as power flowed through Arthur's body with increasing intensity. His cells restructured themselves to accommodate radiant rank energies, while his understanding deepened into something that approached divine wisdom. But unlike Gideon's corruption-fueled ascension, Arthur's breakthrough maintained his essential humanity, power tempered by choice, strength guided by purpose. Then something wonderful happened. Arms wrapped around Arthur's neck from behind, slender and warm and impossibly familiar. But these weren't the small arms of the 12-year-old Chelan he remembered. Amethyst hair cascaded over his shoulders like liquid starlight, while golden eyes that reflected depths of ancient wisdom gazed at him with joy that transcended mortal expression. "Luna," he breathed, feeling his bonded companion's presence settle into his consciousness like a missing piece of himself being restored. She had grown during their separation, her childlike form transformed into that of a young woman whose grace spoke to power refined through perfect loyalty. Her amethyst hair caught the light of the crown of twilight, while her golden eyes reflected the same harmony that flowed through Arthur's transformed understanding. "I told you I would always be by your side," she whispered, her voice carrying notes of devotion and absolute certainty. "The seal is finally broken. Nothing will ever separate us again." Her presence completed something fundamental in Arthur's ascension. Where before he had been reaching for radiant rank through individual understanding, now he achieved it through perfect unity, not just with his sword or his power, but with the bond that defined him more completely than any technique or ability. Power flooded through him as he crossed the threshold between immortal and radiant classification. The crown of twilight blazed with light that made the very air sing with harmonic resonance, while Luna's golden eyes reflected the same impossible radiance. Gideon's scream of fury echoed across dimensions as he realized the magnitude of what he was facing. This wasn't just increased power, it was fundamental transformation that operated on principles he couldn't comprehend. His storm of destruction met the transformed Arthur with results that defied every expectation. Instead of being overwhelmed, Arthur moved through the assault like he was dancing, Luna's presence allowing him to access levels of grace that made impossible evasion seem natural. Her arms remained around his neck, not hindering his movements but enhancing them, their bond creating harmony that transcended individual limitation. "This ends now," Arthur declared, raising Nixthar while gray energy cascaded around both him and Luna in patterns that made existence itself pause to observe. The infernal Armus blazed with desperate power as Gideon poured everything into one final, reality-shattering assault. Phantom axes filled every available space while dimensional cuts sought to tear Arthur apart at the molecular level. The artifact's accumulated corruption manifested as concepts of absolute ending, forces that should have been impossible to counter. But Arthur had moved beyond the need to counter such attacks. Fifth movement of his Grade 6 art, Twilight's End. This was not merely a sword technique, it was the culmination of everything he had learned, everything he had become. The completed movement manifested as a strike that existed in all possible states simultaneously, cutting through not just Gideon's defenses but through the fundamental concepts that allowed his corruption to function. Gray energy followed the blade's path like a tide of perfect balance, Luna's harmony amplifying Arthur's understanding until it reached levels that transcended individual limitation. The attack carried the weight of absolute certainty, not destroying the calamity through force, but revealing the truth that lay beneath all destruction. A pillar of gray light erupted from Arthur's position, ascending toward the heavens like a beacon visible across dimensions. The light didn't burn. It purified, pushing back the miasmic corruption that had sustained Gideon's transformation while revealing the frightened man beneath the cosmic horror. Within that pillar, Arthur and Luna stood together as power settled into new configurations around them. His crown of twilight had become permanent, a visible symbol of unity achieved through wisdom rather than corruption. Luna's golden eyes reflected the same impossible harmony, her presence completing the bond that made true strength possible. But the pillar was not what ended the second calamity. As the gray light forced back his corruption, stripping away the divine power that had transformed him into something beyond human classification, Gideon found himself facing Arthur Nightingale as he truly was, mortal man against transcendent balance. The completed fifth movement struck with precision that existed beyond physical force. Nixthar, guided by perfect unity and enhanced by Luna's presence, carved through the space where Gideon's heart beat with desperate fear, not just cutting flesh, but severing the connections that bound him to the infernal Armis, to his stolen power, to the corruption that had sustained his unnatural existence. Gideon's eyes widened with human comprehension as the blade found its mark. The divine fire that had burned within them since his transformation flickered and died, leaving only the confused gaze of someone who had chosen the wrong path and finally understood the price of that choice. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice carrying nothing but mortal confusion as his enhanced form began to collapse. I was supposed to be human," Arthur finished quietly, lowering Nixthar as Gideon fell to his knees. "We all were." The battlefield fell silent as the last echoes of their conflict faded into stillness. The gray pillar began to dissipate, but its message had been received across every corner of the dimensional space that contained their battles. In the distance, Rose and Seraphina felt the harmonic resonance through their desperate fight with Evelyn. Cecilia and Reka sensed it through their own struggle against the vampires. Arthur stood with Luna's arms still around his neck, her presence anchoring him to humanity, even as power beyond mortal comprehension flowed through his transformed existence. The crown of twilight pulsed with gentle radiance, no longer the blazing beacon of transformation, but the steady glow of balance achieved. The second calamity fell, and the second hero, Arthur Nightingale, was born.